Chapter 5 Bedrashain to Minia Part 1 It is the rule of the Nile to hurry up the river as fast as possible, leaving the ruins to be seen as the boat comes back with the current, but this, like many other canon, is by no means of universal application. The traveller who starts late in the season has, indeed, no other course open to him. He must press on with speed to the end of his journey, if he would get back again at low Nile without being irretrievably stuck on a sandbank till the next inundation floats him off again. But for those who desire not only to see the monuments, but to follow, however superficially, the course of Egyptian history as it is handed down through Egyptian art, it is above all things necessary to start early and to see many things by the way. For the history of ancient Egypt goes against the stream. The earliest monuments lie between Cairo and Siut, while the latest temples to the old gods are chiefly found in Nubia. Those travellers, therefore, who hurry blindly forward with or without a wind, now sailing, now tracking, now punting, passing this place by night and that by day, and never resting till they have gained the farthest point of their journey, begin at the wrong end and see all their sights in precisely inverse order. Memphis and Saqqara and the tombs of Beni Hassan should undoubtedly be visited on the way up. So should El Kab and Tel el Amarna and the oldest parts of Karnak and Luxor. It is not necessary to delay long at any of these places. They may be seen cursorily on the way up, and be more carefully studied on the way down, but they should be seen as they come, no matter at what trifling cost of present delay, and despite any amount of ignorant opposition. For in this way only is it possible to trace the progression and retrogression of the arts from the pyramid builders to the Caesars, or to understand at the time and on the spot in what order that vast and august procession of dynasties swept across the stage of history. For ourselves, as will presently be seen, it happened that we could carry only a part of this program into effect, but that part, happily, was the most important. We never ceased to congratulate ourselves on having made acquaintance with the pyramids of Giza and Saqqara before seeing the tombs of the kings at Thebes, and I feel that it is impossible to overestimate the advantage of studying the sculptures of the tomb of Ti before one's taste is brought into contact with the debased style of Dendera and Esna. We began the great book, in short, as it always should be begun, at its first page, thereby acquiring just that necessary insight without which many an after chapter must have lost more than half its interest. If I seem to insist upon this point, it is because things contrary to custom need a certain amount of insistence, and are sure to be met by opposition. No dragoman, for example, could be made to understand the importance of historical sequence in a matter of this kind, especially in the case of a contract trip. To him, Khufu, Ramesses, and the Ptolemies are one. As for the monuments, they are all ancient Egyptian, and one is just as old and unintelligible as another. He cannot quite understand why travellers come so far and spend so much money to look at them, but he sets it down to a habit of harmless curiosity by which he profits. The truth is, however, that the mere sight-seeing of the Nile demands some little reading and organizing, if only to be enjoyed. We cannot all be profoundly learned, but we can at least do our best to understand what we see, to get rid of obstacles, to put the right thing in the right place. For the land of Egypt is, as I have said, a great book, not very easy reading, perhaps, under any circumstances, but at all events quite difficult enough already without the added puzzlement of being read backwards. And now our next point along the river, as well as our next link in the chain of early monuments, was Beni Hassan, with its famous rock-cut tombs of the 12th dynasty, and Beni Hassan was still more than 145 miles distant. We ought to have gone on again directly, to have weighed anchor and made a few miles that very evening on returning to the boats, but we insisted on a second day in the same place. This, too, with the favourable wind still blowing. It was against all rule and precedent. The captain shook his head, the dragoman remonstrated, in vain. "You will come to learn the value of a wind when you have been longer on the Nile," said the latter, with that air of melancholy resignation which he always assumed when not allowed to have his own way. He was an indolent, good-tempered man, spoke English fairly well, and was perfectly manageable, but that air of resignation came to be aggravating in time. The M.B.'s being of the same mind, however, we had our second day and spent it at Memphis. We ought to have crossed over to Tura, and have seen the great quarries from which the casing stones of the pyramid came, and all the finer limestone with which the temples and palaces of Memphis were built. But the whole mountain-side seemed as if glowing at a white heat on the opposite side of the river, and we said we would put off Tura till our return. So we went our own way, and Alfred shot pigeons, and the writer sketched Mitrahina, and the palms, and the sacred lake of Mina, and the rest grubbed among the mounds for treasure, finding many curious fragments of glass and pottery, and part of an engraved bronze apis, and we had a green, tranquil, lovely day, barren of incident, but very pleasant to remember. The good wind continued to blow all that night, but fell at sunrise, precisely when we were about to start. The river now stretched away before us, smooth as glass, and there was nothing for it, said Rais Hassan, but tracking. We had heard of tracking often enough since coming to Egypt, but without having any definite idea of the process. Coming on deck, however, before breakfast, we found 9 of our poor fellows harnessed to a rope like barge horses, towing the huge boat against the current. 7 of the M.B.'s crew, similarly harnessed, followed at a few yards' distance. The 2 ropes met and crossed and dipped into the water together. Already our last night's mooring place was out of sight, and the pyramid of Onephus stood up amid its lesser brethren on the edge of the desert, as if bidding us good-bye. But the sight of the trackers jarred, somehow, with the placid beauty of the picture. We got used to it, as one gets used to everything in time, but it looked like slaves' work, and shocked our English notions disagreeably. That morning, still tracking, we passed the pyramids of Dashur. A dilapidated brick pyramid, standing in the midst of them, looks like an anguille of black rock thrusting itself up through the limestone bed of the desert. Palms line the bank and intercept the view, but we catch flitting glimpses here and there, looking out especially for that dome-like pyramid which we observed the other day from Saqqara. Seen in the full sunlight, it looks larger and whiter, and more than ever like the roof of the old Palais de Justice far away in Paris. Thus the morning passes. We sit on deck writing letters, reading, watching the sunny riverside pictures that glide by at a foot's pace and are so long in sight. Palm groves, sandbanks, patches of fuzzy-headed durrell, and fields of some yellow flowering herb succeed each other. A boy plods along the bank, leading a camel. They go slowly, but they soon leave us behind. A native boat meets us, floating down sideways with the current. A girl comes to the water's edge with a great empty jar on her head, and waits to fill it till the trackers have gone by. The pigeon towers of a mud village peep above a clump of lebbek trees, a quarter of a mile inland. Here a solitary brown man, with only a felt skull-cap on his head and a slip of scanty tunic fastened about his loins, works a shadoof, stooping and rising, with the regularity of a pendulum. It is the same machine which we shall see by and by depicted in the tombs at Thebes, and the man is so evidently an ancient Egyptian that we find ourselves wondering how he escaped being mummified 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. By and by a little breeze springs up. The men drop the rope and jump on board. The big sail is set, the breeze freshens, and away we go again as merrily as the day we left Cairo. Towards sunset we see a strange object, like a giant obelisk broken off half-way, standing up on the western bank against an orange-gold sky. This is the pyramid of Medum, commonly called the false pyramid. It looks quite near the bank, but this is an effect of powerful light and shadow, for it lies back at least 4 miles from the river. That night, having sailed on till past 9 o'clock, we moor about a mile from Beni Suef, and learn with some surprise that a man must be dispatched to the governor of the town for guards. Not that anything ever happened to anybody at Beni Suef, says Ptolemy, but that the place is supposed not to have a first-rate reputation. If we have guards, we at all events make the governor responsible for our safety and the safety of our possessions. So the guards are sent for, and being posted on the bank, snore loudly all night long just outside our windows. Meanwhile the wind shifts round to the south, and next morning it blows full in our faces. The men, however, track up to Beni Suef to a point where the buildings come down to the water's edge and the towing path ceases, and there we lay to for a while among a fleet of filthy native boats close to the landing place. The approach to Beni Suef is rather pretty. The Khedive has an Italian-looking villa here, which peeps up white and dazzling from the midst of a thickly wooded park. The town lies back a little from the river. A few coffee-houses and a kind of promenade face the landing place, and a mosque built to the verge of the bank stands out picturesquely against the bend of the river. And now it is our object to turn that corner so as to get into a better position for starting when the wind drops. The current here runs deep and strong, so that we have both wind and water dead against us. Half our men clamber round the corner like cats, carrying the rope with them. The rest keep the dahabeah off the bank with punting poles. The rope strains, a pole breaks, we struggle forward a few feet and can get no farther. Then the men rest a while, try again, and are again defeated. So the fight goes on. The promenade and the windows of the mosque become gradually crowded with lookers-on. Some 3 or 4 cloaked and bearded men have chairs brought, and sit gravely smoking their chibouks on the bank above, enjoying the entertainment. Meanwhile the water-carriers come and go, filling their goat-skins at the landing-place. Donkeys and camels are brought down to drink. Girls in dark blue gowns and coarse black veils come with huge water jars laid sideways upon their heads, and having filled and replaced them upright, walk away with stately steps, as if each ponderous vessel were a crown. So the day passes. Driven back again and again, but still resolute, our sailors, by dint of sheer doggedness, get us round the bad corner at last. The Bagstones follow suit a little later, and we both moor about a quarter of a mile above the town. Then follows a night of adventures. Again our guards sleep profoundly, but the bad characters of Beni Suef are very wide awake. One gentleman, actuated no doubt by the friendliest motives, pays a midnight visit to the Bagstones, but being detected, chased, and fired at, escapes by jumping overboard. Our turn comes about 2 hours later, when the writer, happening to be awake, hears a man swim softly round the fillet. To strike a light and frighten everybody into sudden activity is the work of a moment. The whole boat is instantly in an uproar. Lanterns are lighted on deck, a patrol of sailors is set. Ptolemy loads his gun, and the thief slips away in the dark, like a fish. The guards, of course, slept sweetly through it all. Honest fellows! They were paid $1 a night to do it, and they had nothing on their minds. Having lodged a formal complaint next morning against the inhabitants of the town, we received a visit from a sallow personage clad in a long black robe and a voluminous white turban. This was the chief of the guards. He smoked a great many pipes, drank numerous cups of coffee, listened to all we had to say, looked wise, and finally suggested that the number of our guards should be doubled. Chapter 5 Bedrashane to Minia Part 2 I ventured to object that if they slept unanimously, 40 would not be of much more use than 4. Whereupon he rose, drew himself to his full height, touched his beard, and said with a magnificent melodramatic air, If they sleep, they shall be bastinadoed till they die. And now our good luck seemed to have deserted us. For 3 days and nights the adverse wind continued to blow with such force that the men could not even track against it. Moored under that dreary bank, we saw our 10 days' start melting away, and could only make the best of our misfortunes. Happily the long island close by, and the banks on both sides of the river, were populous with sand-grouse, so Alfred went out daily with his faithful George and his unerring gun, and brought home game in abundance, while we took long walks, sketched boats and camels, and chaffered with native women for silver torques and bracelets. These torques, in Arabic tak, are tubular but massive, penannular, about as thick as one's little finger, and finished with a hook at one end and a twisted loop at the other. The girls would sometimes put their veils aside and make a show of bargaining, but more frequently, after standing for a moment with great wondering black velvety eyes staring shyly into ours, they would take fright like a troop of startled deer and vanish with shrill cries, half of laughter, half of terror. At Beni Suef we encountered our first sandstorm. It came down the river about noon, showing like a yellow fog on the horizon, and rolling rapidly before the wind. It tore the river into angry waves, and blotted out the landscape as it came. The distant hills disappeared first, then the palms beyond the island, then the boats close by. Another second, and the air was full of sand. The whole surface of the plain seemed in motion. The banks rippled, the yellow dust poured down through every rift and cleft in hundreds of tiny cataracts. But it was a sight not to be looked upon with impunity. Hair, eyes, mouth, ears were instantly filled, and we were driven to take refuge in the saloon. Here, although every window and door had been shut before the storm came, the sand found its way in clouds. Books, papers, carpets were covered with it, and it settled again as fast as it was cleared away. This lasted just 1 hour, and was followed by a burst of heavy rain, after which the sky cleared and we had a lovely afternoon. From this time forth we saw no more rain in Egypt. At length, on the morning of the 4th day after our first appearance at Beni Suef, and the 7th since leaving Cairo, the wind veered around again to the north, and we once more got under way. It was delightful to see the big sail again towering up overhead, and to hear the swish of the water under the cabin windows, but we were still 109 miles from Rhoda, and we knew that nothing but an extraordinary run of luck could possibly get us there by the 23rd of the month, with time to see Beni Hassan on the way. Meanwhile, however, we make fair progress, mooring at sunset when the wind falls, about 3 miles north of Biba. Next day, by help of the same light breeze which again springs up a little after dawn, we go at a good pace between flat banks fringed here and there with palms, and studded with villages more or less picturesque. There is not much to see, and yet one never wants for amusement. Now we pass an island of sandbank covered with snow-white paddy-birds, which rise tumultuously at our approach. Next comes Biba, perched high along the edge of the precipitous bank, its odd-looking Coptic convent roofed all over with little mud domes, like a cluster of earth bubbles. By and by we pass a deserted sugar factory, with shattered windows and a huge, gaunt, blackened chimney, worthy of Birmingham or Sheffield. And now we catch a glimpse of the railway, and hear the last scream of a departing engine. At night we moor within sight of the factory chimneys and hydraulic tubes of Magaga, and next day get on nearly to Golosana, which is the last station town before Minia. It is now only too clear that we must give up all thought of pushing on to Beni Hassan before the rest of the party shall come on board. We have reached the evening of our 9th day. We are still 48 miles from Rhoda, and another adverse wind might again delay us indefinitely along the way. All risks taken into account, we decide to put off our meeting till the 24th, and transfer the appointment to Minia, thus giving ourselves time to track all the way in case of need. So an Arabic telegram is concocted, and our fleetest runner starts off with it to Golosana before the office closes for the night. The breeze, however, does not fail, but comes back next morning with the dawn. Having passed Golosana, we come to a wide reach in the river, at which point we are honoured by a visit from a Muslim sultan of particular sanctity, named Holy Sheikh Cotton. Now Holy Sheikh Cotton, who is a well-fed, healthy-looking young man of about 30, makes his first appearance swimming, with his garments twisted into a huge turban on the top of his head, and only his chin above water. Having made his toilette in the small boat, he presents himself on deck, and receives an enthusiastic welcome. Rais Hassan hugs him, the pilot kisses him, the sailors come up one by one, bringing little tributes of tobacco and piastres, which he accepts with the air of a pope receiving Peter's pence. All dripping as he is, and smiling like an affable Triton, he next proceeds to touch the tiller, the ropes, and the ends of the yards, in order, says Ptolemy, to make them holy, and then, with some kind of final charm or muttered incantation, he plunges into the river again, and swims off to repeat the same performance on board the Bagstones. From this moment the prosperity of our voyage is assured. The captain goes about with a smile on his stern face, and the crew look as happy as if we had given them a guinea, for nothing can go wrong with a dahabeah that has been made holy by holy Sheikh Cotton. We are now certain to have favourable winds, to pass the cataract without incident, to come back in health and safety as we set out. But what, it may be asked, has holy Sheikh Cotton done to make his blessing so efficacious? He gets money in plenty, he fasts no oftener than other Mohammedans, he has 2 wives, he never does a stroke of work, and he looks the picture of sleek prosperity. Yet he is a saint of the first water, and when he dies miracles will be performed at his tomb, and his eldest son will succeed him in the business. We had the pleasure of becoming acquainted with a good many saints in the course of our Eastern travels, but I do not know that we ever found they had done anything to merit the position. One very horrible old man named Sheikh Salim has, it is true, been sitting on a dirt heap near Fashut, unclothed, unwashed, unshaven, for the last half-century or more, never even lifting his hand to his mouth to feed himself. But Sheikh Cotton had gone to no such pious lengths, and was not even dirty. We are by this time drawing towards a range of yellow cliffs that have long been visible on the horizon, and which figure in the maps as Gebel et Tair. The Arabian desert has been closing up on the eastern bank for some time past, and now rolls in on undulating drifts to the water's edge. Yellow boulders crop out here and there above the mounded sand, which looks as if it might cover many a forgotten temple. Presently the clay bank is gone, and a low barrier of limestone rock, black and shiny next to the water line, has taken its place. And now, a long way ahead, where the river bends and the level cliffs lead on into the far distance, a little brown speck is pointed out as the convent of the Pulley. Perched on the brink of the precipice, it looks no bigger than an ant-heap. We had heard much of the fine view to be seen from the platform on which this convent is built, and it had originally entered into our programme as a place to be visited on the way. But Minia has now to be gained at all costs, so this project has to be abandoned with a sigh. And now the rocky barrier rises higher, quarried here and there in dazzling gaps of snow-white cuttings. And now the convent shows clearer, and the cliffs become loftier, and the bend in the river is reached, and a long perspective of flat-topped precipice stretches away into the dim distance. It is a day of saints and swimmers. As the dahabeah approaches, a brown pole is seen bobbing up and down in the water a few hundred yards ahead. Then 1, 2, 3 bronze figures dash down a steep ravine below the convent walls, and plunge into the river. A shrill chorus of voices, growing momentarily more audible, is borne upon the wind, and in a few minutes the boat is beset by a shoal of mendicant monks vociferating with all their might. "Ana Christian, Yahawaji! Ana Christian, Yahawaji! I am a Christian, O traveller!" As these are only Coptic monks and not Moslem santons, the sailors, half in rough play, half in earnest, drive them off with punting poles, and only one shivering, streaming object, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, is allowed to come on board. He is a fine, shapely man, aged about 40, with splendid eyes and teeth, a well-formed head, skin the colour of a copper beech leaf, and a face expressive of such ignorance, timidity, and half-savage watchfulness as makes one's heart ache. And this is a Copt, a descendant of the true Egyptian stock, one of those whose remote ancestors exchanged the worship of the old gods for Christianity under the rule of Theodosius some 1500 years ago, and whose blood is supposed to be purer of Mohammedan intermixture than any in Egypt. Remembering these things, it is impossible to look at him without a feeling of profound interest. It may be only fancy, yet I think I see in him a different type to that of the Arab, a something, however slight, which recalls the sculptured figures in the tomb of Tea. But while we are thinking about his magnificent pedigree, our poor Copt's teeth are chattering piteously. So we give him a shilling or two for the sake of all he represents in the history of the world, and with these, and the donation of an empty bottle, he swims away contented, crying again and again, Kether Cairake Sitte, Kether Cairake Keter. Thank you, ladies, thank you very much. And now the convent, with its clustered domes, is past and left behind. The rock here is of the same rich tawny hue as at Tura, and the horizontal strata of which it is composed have evidently been deposited by water. That the Nile must at some remote time have flowed here in an immensely higher level seems also probable, for the whole face of the range is honeycombed and water-worn for miles in succession. Seeing how these fantastic forms, arched, clustered, and pendant, resemble the recessed ornamentation of Saracenic buildings, I could not help wondering whether some early Arab architect might not once upon a time have taken a hint from some such rocks as these. Thus the day wanes, and the level cliffs keep with us all the way, now breaking into little lateral valleys and cul-de-sac in which nestle clusters of tiny huts and green patches of lupin, now plunging sheer down into the river, now receding inland and leaving space for a belt of cultivated soil and a fringe of feathery palms. By and by comes sunset, when every cast shadow in the recesses of the cliffs turns to pure violet, and the face of the rock glows with a ruddier gold, and the palms on the western bank stand up in solid bronze against a crimson horizon. Then the sun dips, and instantly the whole range of cliffs turns to a dead greenish gray, while the sky above and behind them is as suddenly suffused with pink. When this effect has lasted for something like 8 minutes, a vast arch of deep blue shade, about as large in diameter as a rainbow, creeps slowly up the eastern horizon, and remains distinctly visible as long as the pink flush against which it is defined yet lingers in the sky. Finally the flush fades out, the blue becomes uniform, the stars begin to show, and only a broad glow in the west marks which way the sun went down. About a quarter of an hour later comes the afterglow, when for a few minutes the sky is filled with a soft, magical light, and the twilight gloom lies warm upon the landscape. When this goes, it is night, but still one long beam of light streams up in the tracks of the sun, and remains visible for more than 2 hours after the darkness has set in. Chapter 5 Bedrashane to Minieh, Part 3. Such is the sunset we see this evening as we approach Minieh, and such is the sunset we are destined to see with scarcely a shade of difference at the same hour and under precisely the same conditions for many a month to come. It is very beautiful, very tranquil, full of wonderful light and most subtle gradations of tone, and attended by certain phenomena of which I shall have more to say presently, but it lacks the variety and gorgeousness of our northern skies. Nor, given the dry atmosphere of Egypt, can it be otherwise. Those who go up the Nile expecting, as I did, to see magnificent Turneresque pageants of purple and flame color and gold, will be disappointed as I was. For your Turneresque pageant cannot be achieved without such accessories of cloud and vapor as in Nubia are wholly unknown, and in Egypt are of the rarest occurrence. Once, and only once, in the course of an unusually protracted sojourn on the river, had we the good fortune to witness a grand display of the kind, and then we had been nearly 3 months in the dahabeah. Meanwhile, however, we never weary of these stainless skies, but find in them, evening after evening, fresh depths of beauty and repose. As for that strange transfer of colour from the mountains to the sky, we had repeatedly observed it while travelling in the Dolomites the year before, and had always found it take place, as now, at the moment of the sun's first disappearance. But what of this mighty after-shadow, climbing half the heavens and bringing night with it? Can it be the rising shadow of the world projected on the one horizon as the sun sinks on the other? I leave the problem for wiser travellers to solve. We have not science enough amongst us to account for it. That same evening, just as the twilight came on, we saw another wonder, the new moon on the first night of her quarter, a perfect orb, dusky, distinct, and outlined all round with a thread of light no thicker than a hair. Nothing could be more brilliant than this tiny rim of flashing silver, while every detail of the softly glowing globe within its compass was clearly visible. Tycho with its vast crater showed like a volcano on a raised map, and near the edge of the moon's surface, where the light and shadow met, keen sparkles of mountain summits catching the light and relieved against the dusk were to be seen by the naked eye. 2 or 3 evenings later, however, when the silver ring was changed to a broad crescent, the unilluminated part was, as it were, extinguished, and could no longer be discerned even by the help of a glass. The wind having failed, as usual, at sunset, the crew set to work with a will and punted the rest of the way, so bringing us to Minia about 9 that night. Next morning we found ourselves moored close under the Khedive's summer palace, so close that one could have tossed a pebble against the latticed windows of His Highness's harem. A fat gatekeeper sat outside in the sun, smoking his morning chibouk and gossiping with the passers-by. A narrow promenade scantily planted with sycamore figs ran between the palace and the river. A steamer or two and a crowd of native boats lay moored under the bank, and yonder, at the far end of the promenade, a minaret and a cluster of whitewashed houses showed which way one must turn in going to the town. It chanced to be market day, so we saw Minia under its best aspect, than which nothing could well be more squalid, dreary, and depressing. It was like a town dropped unexpectedly into the midst of a ploughed field, the streets being mere trodden lanes of mud dust, and the houses a succession of windowless mud prisons with their backs to the thoroughfare. The bazaar, which consists of 2 or 3 lanes a little wider than the rest, is roofed over here and there with rotting palm rafters and bits of tattered matting, while the market is held in a space of waste ground outside the town. The former, with its little cupboard-like shops in which the merchants sit cross-legged like shabby old idols in shabby old shrines, the ill-furnished shelves, the familiar Manchester goods, the gaudy native stuffs, the old red saddles and faded rugs hanging up for sale, the smart Greek stores where Bass's ale, claret, curaçao, cypress, vermouth, cheese, pickles, sardines, Worcester sauce, blacking, biscuits, preserved meats, candles, cigars, matches, sugar, salt, stationery, fireworks, jams, and patent medicines can all be bought at one fell swoop. The native cook's shop exhaling savory perfumes of kebabs and lentil soup, and presided over by an Abyssinian sawyer blacker than the blackest historical personage ever was painted. The surging, elbowing, clamorous crowd, the donkeys, the camels, the street cries, the chatter, the dust, the flies, the fleas, and the dogs, all put us in mind of the poorer quarters of Cairo. In the market it is even worse. Here are hundreds of country folk sitting on the ground behind their baskets of fruits and vegetables. Some have eggs, butter, and buffalo cream for sale, while others sell sugar canes, limes, cabbages, tobacco, barley, dried lentils, split beans, maize, wheat, and durra. The women go to and fro with bouquets of live poultry. The chickens scream, the sellers rave, the buyers bargain at the top of their voices, the dust flies in clouds, the sun pours down floods of light and heat, you can scarcely hear yourself speak, and the crowd is as dense as that other crowd which is at this very moment, on this very Christmas Eve, is circulating among the alleys of Leadenhall Market. The things were very cheap. 100 eggs cost about 14 pence in English money, chickens sold for 5 pence each, pigeons from 2 pence to 2 pence halfpenny, and fine live geese for 2 shillings a head. The turkeys, however, which were large and excellent, were priced as high as 3 and 6 pence, being about half as much as one pays in Middle and Upper Egypt for a lamb. A good sheep may be bought for 16 shillings or a pound. The M.B.s, who had no dragoman and did their own marketing, were very busy here, laying in a store of fresh provision, bargaining fluently in Arabic, and escorted by a bodyguard of sailors. A solitary dome palm, the northernmost of its race and the first specimen one meets with on the Nile, grows in a garden adjoining this marketplace, but we could scarcely see it for the blinding dust. Now a dome palm is just the sort of tree that De Wint should have painted, odd, angular, with forked stems, each of which terminates in a shock-headed crown of stiff finger-like fronds, shading heavy clusters of big shiny nuts about the size of Jerusalem artichokes. It is, I suppose, the only nut in the world of which one throws away the kernel and eats the shell, but the kernel is as hard as marble, while the shell is fibrous and tastes like stale gingerbread. The dome palm must bifurcate, for bifurcation is the law of its being, but I could never discover whether there was any fixed limit to the number of stems into which it might subdivide. At the same time, I do not remember having seen any with less than 2 heads or more than 6. Coming back through the town, we were accosted by a withered, one-eyed hag like a reanimated mummy, who offered to tell us our fortunes. Before her lay a dirty rag of handkerchief full of shells, pebbles, and chips of broken glass and pottery. Squatting toad-like under a sunny bit of wall, the lower part of her face closely veiled, her skinny arms covered with blue and green glass bracelets, and her fingers with misshapen silver rings, she hung over these treasures, shook, mixed, and interrogated them with all the fervour of divination, and delivered a string of the prophecies usually forthcoming on these occasions. You have a friend far away, and your friend is thinking of you. There is good fortune in store for you, and money is coming to you, and pleasant news on the way. You will soon receive letters in which there will be something to vex you, but more to make you glad. Within 30 days you will unexpectedly meet one whom you dearly love, etc., etc., etc. It was just the old familiar story retold in Arabic, without even such variations as might have been expected from the lips of an old fellaha born and bred in a provincial town of Middle Egypt. It may be that ophthalmia especially prevailed in this part of the country, or that being brought unexpectedly into the midst of a large crowd, one observed the people more narrowly, but I certainly never saw so many one-eyed human beings as that morning at Minia. There must have been present in the streets and marketplace from 10 to 12,000 natives of all ages, and I believe it is not an exaggeration to say that at least every 20th person, down to little toddling children of 3 and 4 years of age, was blind of an eye. Not being a particularly well-favoured race, this defect added the last touch of repulsiveness to faces already sullen, ignorant, and unfriendly. A more unprepossessing population I would never wish to see, the men half stealthy, half insolent, the women bold and fierce, the children filthy, sickly, stunted, and stolid. Nothing in provincial Egypt is so painful to witness as the neglected condition of very young children. Those belonging even to the better class are for the most part shabbily clothed and of more than doubtful cleanliness, while the offspring of the very poor are simply encrusted with dirt and sores and swarming with vermin. It is at first hard to believe that the parents of these unfortunate babies err not from cruelty, but through sheer ignorance and superstition. Yet it is so, and the time when these people can be brought to comprehend the most elementary principles of sanitary reform is yet far distant. To wash young children is injurious to health, therefore the mothers suffer them to fall into a state of personal uncleanliness which is alone enough to engender disease. To brush away the flies that beset their eyes is impious, hence ophthalmia and various kinds of blindness. I have seen infants lying in their mother's arms with 6 or 8 flies in each eye. I have seen the little helpless hands put down reprovingly if they approached the seat of annoyance. I have seen children of 4 and 5 years old with a large fleshy lump growing out where the pupil had been destroyed. Taking these things into account, the wonder is, after all, not that 3 children should die in Egypt out of every 5, not that each 20th person in certain districts should be blind or partially blind, but that so many as 40% of the whole infant population should actually live to grow up, and that 95% should enjoy the blessing of sight. For my own part, I had not been many weeks on the Nile before I began systematically to avoid going about the native towns whenever it was practicable to do so. That I may so have lost an opportunity of now and then seeing more of the street life of the people is very probable, but such outside glimpses are of little real value, and I at all events escaped the sight of much poverty, sickness, and squalor. The condition of the inhabitants is not worse, perhaps, in an Egyptian beled than in many an Irish village, but the condition of the children is so distressing that one would willingly go any number of miles out of the way rather than witness their suffering without the power to alleviate it. If the population in and about Minieh are personally unattractive, their appearance at all events matches their reputation, which is as bad as that of their neighbours. Of the manners and customs of Beni Suef we had already some experience, while public opinion charges Minieh, Rhoda, and most of the towns and villages north of Ceuta with the like marauding propensities. As for the villages at the foot of Beni Hassan, they have been mere dens of thieves for many generations, and though razed to the ground some years ago by way of punishment, are now rebuilt and in as bad odour as ever. It is necessary, therefore, in all this part of the river, not only to hire guards at night, but, when the boat is moored, to keep a sharp look-out against thieves by day. In Upper Egypt it is very different. There the natives are good-looking, good-natured, gentle, and kindly, and though clever enough at manufacturing and selling modern antiquities, are not otherwise dishonest. That same evening, it was Christmas Eve, nearly 2 hours earlier than their train was supposed to be due, the rest of our party arrived at Minieh. Chapter 6. Minieh to Ceuta, Part 1. It is Christmas Day. The M.B.s are coming to dinner, the cooks are up to their eyes in entrees, the crew are treated to a sheep in honor of the occasion, the newcomers are unpacking, and we are all gradually settling down into our respective places. Now, the newcomers consist of 4 persons, a painter, a happy couple, and a maid. The painter has already been up the Nile 3 times, and brings a fund of experience into the council. He knows all about sandbanks and winds and mooring places, and is acquainted with most of the native governors and consuls along the river, and is great on the subject of what to eat, drink, and avoid. The stern cabin is given to him for a studio, and contains frames, canvases, drawing paper, and easels enough to start a provincial school of art. He is going to paint a big picture at Abu Simbel. The happy couple, it is unnecessary to say, are on their wedding tour. In point of fact, they have not yet been married a month. The bridegroom is what the world chooses to call an idle man, that is to say, he has scholarship, delicate health, and leisure. The bride, for convenience, shall be called the little lady. Of people who are struggling through that helpless, idle phase of human life called the honeymoon, it is not fair to say more than that they are both young enough to make the situation interesting. Meanwhile, the deck must be cleared of the new luggage that has come on board, and the day passes in a confusion of unpacking, arranging, and putting away. Such running to and fro as there is down below, such turning out of boxes and knocking up of temporary shelves, such talking and laughing and hammering. Nor is this bustle confined downstairs. Ptolemy and the waiters are just as busy above, adorning the upper deck with palm branches and hanging the boat all round with rows of coloured lanterns. One can hardly believe, however, that it is Christmas Day, that there are fires blazing at home in every room, that the church field perhaps is white with snow, and that the familiar bells are ringing merrily across the frosty air. Here, at midday, it is already too hot on deck without the awning, and when we moor towards sunset near a riverside village in a grove of palms, the cooler air of evening is delicious. There is novelty even in such a commonplace matter as dining out on the Nile. You go and return in your felucca as if it were a carriage, and your entertainers summon you by firing a dinner gun instead of sounding a gong. Wise people who respect the feelings of their cooks fire a dressing gun as well, for watches soon differ in a hopeless way for want of the church clock to set them by, and it is always possible that host and guest may be an hour or 2 apart in their reckoning. The customary guns having therefore been fired, and the party assembled, we sat down to one of Cook Bedawi's prodigious banquets. Not, however, till the plum pudding, blazing demonically, appeared on the scene, did any of us succeed in believing that it was really Christmas Day. Nothing could be prettier or gayer than the spectacle that awaited us when we rose from table. 150 coloured lanterns outlined the boat from end to end, sparkled up the masts, and cast broken reflections in the moving current. The upper deck, hung with flags and partly closed in with awnings, looked like a bower of palms. The stars and the crescent moon shone overhead. Dim outlines of trees and headlands and a vague perspective of gleaming river were visible in the distance, while a light gleamed now and then in the direction of the village, or a dusky figure flitted along the bank. Meanwhile, there was a sound of revelry by night, for our sailors had invited the Bagstone's crew to unlimited coffee and tobacco, and had quite a large party on the lower deck. They drummed, they sang, they danced, they dressed up, improvised a comic scene, and kept their audience in a roar. Rais Hassan did the honours. George, Ptolemy, and the maids sat apart at the second table and sipped their coffee genteelly. We looked on and applauded. At 10 o'clock a pan of magnesium powder was burned, and our fantasia ended with a blaze of light like a pantomime. In Egypt, by the way, any entertainment which is enlivened by music, dancing, or fireworks is called a fantasia. And now, sometimes sailing, sometimes tracking, sometimes punting, we go on, day by day, making what speed we can. Things do not, of course, always fall out exactly as one would have them. The wind too often fails when we most need it, and gets up when there is something to be seen on shore. Thus, after a whole morning of tracking, we reach Beni Hassan at the moment when a good breeze has suddenly filled our sails for the first time in 48 hours. And so, yielding to counsels which we afterwards deplored, we pass on with many a longing look at the terraced doorways pierced along the cliffs. At Rhoda, in the same way, we touch for only a few minutes to post and inquire for letters, and put off till our return the inland excursion to Deir el Nakhul, where is to be seen the famous painting of the Colossus on the sledge. But sights deferred are fated sometimes to remain unseen, as we found by and by to our exceeding loss and regret. Meanwhile the skies are always cloudless, the days warm, the evenings exquisite. We, of course, live very much in the open air. When there is no wind, we land and take long walks by the riverside. When on board, we sketch, write letters, read Champollion, Bunsen, and Gardner Wilkinson, and work hard at Egyptian dynasties. The sparrows and water wagtails perch familiarly on the awnings and hop about the deck. The cocks and hens chatter, the geese cackle, the turkeys gobble in their coops close by, and our sacrificial sheep, leading a solitary life in the felucca, comes baaing in the rear. Sometimes we have as many as 100 chickens on board, to say nothing of pigeons and rabbits, and 2 or even 3 sheep in the felucca. The poultry yard is railed off, however, at the extreme end of the stern, so that the creatures are well away from the drawing-room, and when we moor at a suitable place, they are let out for a few hours to peck about the banks and enjoy their liberty. Elle and the little lady feed these hapless prisoners with breakfast scraps every morning, to the profound amusement of the steersman, who, unable to conceive any other motive, imagines they are fattening them for table. Such is our Noah's Ark life, pleasant, peaceful, and patriarchal. Even on days when there is little to see and nothing to do, it is never dull. Trifling incidents which have for us the excitement of novelty are continually occurring. Other dahabiyas, their flags and occupants, are a constant source of interest. Meeting at mooring places for the night, we now and then exchange visits. Passing each other by day, we dip ensigns, fire salutes, and punctiliously observe the laws of maritime etiquette. Sometimes a Cook's excursion steamer hurries by, crowded with tourists, or a government tug towing 3 or 4 great barges closely packed with wretched-looking, half-naked fellaheen bound for forced labor on some new railway or canal. Occasionally we pass a dahabiya sticking fast upon a sandbank, and sometimes we stick on one ourselves. Then the men fly to their punting poles, or jump into the river like water dogs, and, grunting in melancholy cadence, shove the boat off with their shoulders. The birds, too, are new, and we are always looking out for them. Perhaps we see a top-heavy pelican balancing his huge yellow bill over the edge of the stream and fishing for his dinner, or a flight of wild geese trailing across the sky towards sunset, or a select society of vultures perched all in a row upon a ledge of rock, and solemn as the bench of bishops. Then there are the herons who stand on one leg and doze in the sun, the strutting hoopoes with their legendary topknots, the blue and green bee-eaters hovering over the uncut dura. The pied kingfisher, black and white like a magpie, sits fearlessly under the bank and never stirs, though the tow-rope swings close above his head and the dahabeah glides within a few feet of the shore. The paddy-birds whiten the sandbanks by hundreds and rise in a cloud at our approach. The sacred hawk, circling overhead, utters the same sweet, piercing, melancholy note that the pharaohs listened to of old. The scenery is, for the most part, of the ordinary Nile pattern, and for many a mile we see the same things over and over again: the level bank shelving down steeply to the river, the strip of cultivated soil, green with maize or tawny with dura, the frequent mud village and palm grove, the deserted sugar factory with its ungainly chimney and shattered windows, the water wheel slowly revolving with its necklace of pots, the shadoof worked by two brown athletes, the field of laden camels, the desert, all sandhills and sandplains with its background of mountains, the long reach and the gleaming sail ahead. Sometimes, however, as at Calm Amar, we skirt the ancient brick mounds of some forgotten city, with fragments of arched foundation and even walls and doorways reaching down to the water's edge, or sailing close under ranges of huge perpendicular cliffs, as at Gebel Abu Fada, startle the cormorants from their haunts, and peer as we pass into the dim recesses of many a rock-cut tomb excavated just above the level of the inundation. This Gebel Abu Fada has a bad name for sudden winds, especially at the beginning and end of the range, where the Nile bends abruptly and the valley opens out at right angles to the river. It is fine to see Rais Hassan as we approach one of the worst of these bad bits, a point where two steep ravines divided by a bold headland command the passage like a pair of grim cannon, and rake it with blasts from the northeastern desert. Here the current, flowing deep and strong, is met by the wind and runs high in crested waves. Our little captain, kicking off his shoes, himself springs up the rigging and there stands silent and watchful. The sailors, ready to shift our mainsail at the word of command, cling some to the shoghool and some to the end of the yard. The boat tears on before the wind. The great bluff looms up darker and nearer. Then comes a breathless moment. Then a sharp, sudden word from the little man in the main rigging, a yell and a whoop from the sailors, a slow, heavy lurch of the flapping sail, and the corner is turned in safety. The cliffs here are very fine, much loftier and less uniform than at Gebel et Tair, rent into strange forms, as of sphinxes, cheese rings, towers, and bastions, honeycombed with long ranges of rock-cut tombs, and undermined by water-washed caverns in which lurk a few lingering crocodiles. If at Gebel et Tair the rock is worn into some semblance of arabesque ornamentation, here it looks as if inscribed all over with mysterious records in characters not unlike the Hebrew. Records they are, too, of prehistoric days, chronicles of his own deeds carved by the great god Nile himself, the Hypemu of ancient time, but the language in which they are written has never been spoken by man. Chapter 6. Minia to Siut, Part 2. As for the rock-cut tombs of Gebel Abu Fada, they must number many hundreds. For nearly 12 miles the range runs parallel to the river, and throughout that distance the face of the cliffs is pierced with innumerable doorways. Some are small and square, 20 or 30 together, like rows of portholes. Others are isolated. Some are cut so high up that they must have been approached from above. Others again come close upon the level of the river. Some of the doorways are faced to represent jambs and architraves. Some, excavated laterally, appear to consist of a series of chambers, and are lit from without by small windows cut in the rock. One is approached by a flight of rough steps leading up from the water's edge, and another, hewn high in the face of the cliff, just within the mouth of a little ravine, shows a simple but imposing facade supported by 4 detached pillars. No modern travellers seem to visit these tombs, while those of the old school, as Wilkinson, Champollion, etc., dismiss them with a few observations. Yet, with the single exception of the mountains behind Thebes, there is not, I believe, any one spot in Egypt which contains such a multitude of sepulchre excavations. Many look, indeed, as if they might belong to the same interesting and early epoch as those of Beni Hassan. I may here mention that about halfway, or rather less than halfway, along the whole length of the range, I observed 2 large hieroglyph stelae incised upon the face of a projecting mass of boldly rounded cliff at a height of perhaps 150 feet above the river. These stelae, apparently royal ovals, and sculptured as unusual side by side, may have measured from 12 to 15 feet in height, but in the absence of any near object by which to scale them, I could form but a rough guess as to their actual dimensions. The boat was just then going so fast that to sketch or take notes of the hieroglyphs was impossible. Before I could adjust my glass they were already in the rear, and by the time I had called the rest of the party together, they were no longer distinguishable. Coming back several months later, I looked for them again, but without success, for the intense midday sun was then pouring full upon the rocks, to the absolute obliteration of everything like shallow detail. While watching vainly, however, for the stela, I was compensated by the unexpected sight of a colossal bas-relief high up on the northward face of a cliff standing, so to say, at the corner of one of those little recesses or cul-de-sac which here and there break the uniformity of the range. The sculptured relief of this large subject was apparently very low, but owing to the angle at which it met the light, one figure, which could not have measured less than 18 or 20 feet in height, was distinctly visible. I immediately drew Elle's attention to the spot, and she not only discerned the figure without the help of a glass, but believed, like myself, that she could see traces of a second. As neither stela nor the bas-relief would seem to have been observed by previous travellers, I may add for the guidance of others that the round and tower-like rock upon which the former are sculptured lies about a mile to the southward of the Sheikh's tomb and palm tree, a strikingly picturesque bit which no one can fail to notice, and a little beyond some very large excavations near the water's edge, while the bas-relief is to be found at a short distance below the Coptic convent and cemetery. Having for nearly 12 miles skirted the base of Gebel Abu Feda, by far the finest panoramic stretch of rock scenery on this side of the Second Cataract, the Nile takes an abrupt bend to the eastward, and thence flows through many miles of cultivated flat. On coming to this sudden elbow, the wind, which had hitherto been carrying us along at a pace but little inferior to that of a steamer, now struck us full on the beam, and drove the boat to shore with such violence that all the steersman could do was just to run the Philae's nose into the bank, and steer clear of some 10 or 12 native cangias that had been driven in before us. The bagstones rushed in next, and presently a large iron-built dahabeah, having come gallantly along under the cliffs with all sail set, was seen to make a vain struggle at the fatal corner, and then plunge headlong at the bank, like King Agib's ship upon the Lodestone Mountain. Imprisoned here all the afternoon, we exchanged visits of condolence with our neighbours in misfortune, had our ears nearly cut to pieces by the driving sand, and failed signally in the endeavour to take a walk on the shore. Still the fury of the storm went on increasing. The wind howled, the river raced in turbid waves, the sand drove in clouds, and the face of the sky was darkened as if by a London fog. Meanwhile one boat after another was hurried to shore, and before nightfall we numbered a fleet of some 20-odd craft, native and foreign. It took the united strength of both crews all next day to warp the Philae and bagstones across the river by means of a rope and an anchor, an expedient that deserves special mention, not for its amazing novelty or ingenuity, but because our men declared it to be impracticable. Their fathers, they said, had never done it. Their fathers' fathers had never done it. Therefore it was impossible. Being impossible, why should they attempt it? They did attempt it, however, and much to their astonishment they succeeded. It was, I think, towards the afternoon of this second day, when strolling by the margin of the river, that we first made the acquaintance of that renowned insect, the Egyptian beetle. He was a very fine specimen of his race, nearly half an inch long in the back, as black and shiny as a scarab cut in jet, and busily engaged in the preparation of a large rissole of mud, which he presently began laboriously propelling up the bank. We stood and watched him for some time, half in admiration, half in pity. His rissole was at least 4 times bigger than himself, and to roll it up that steep incline to a point beyond the level of next summer's inundation was a labor of Hercules for so small a creature. One longed to play the part of the Deus ex machina and carry it up the bank for him, but that would have been a denouement beyond his power of appreciation. We all know the old story of how this beetle lays its eggs by the river's brink, encloses them in a ball of moist clay, rolls the beetle to a safe place on the edge of the desert, buries it in the sand, and when his time comes, dies content, having provided for the safety of his successors. Hence his mythic fame. Hence all the quaint symbolism that by degrees attached itself to his little person, and ended by investing him with a special sacredness which has often been mistaken for actual worship. Standing by thus, watching the movements of the creature, its untiring energy, its extraordinary muscular strength, its business-like devotion to the matter in hand, one sees how subtle a lesson the old Egyptian moralists had presented to them for contemplation, and with how fine a combination of wisdom and poetry they regarded this little black scarab, not only as an emblem of the creative and preserving power, but perhaps also of the immortality of the soul. As a type, no insect has ever had so much greatness thrust upon him. He became a hieroglyph, and stood for a word signifying both to be and to transform. His portrait was multiplied 1,000,000-fold, sculptured over the portals of temples, fitted to the shoulders of a god, engraved on gems, moulded in pottery, painted on sarcophagi and the walls of tombs, worn by the living and buried with the dead. Every traveller on the Nile brings away a handful of the smaller scarabs, genuine or otherwise. Some may not particularly care to possess them, yet none can help buying them, if only because other people do so, or to get rid of a troublesome dealer, or to give to friends at home. I doubt, however, if even the most enthusiastic scarab fanciers really feel in all its force the symbolism attaching to these little gems, or appreciate the exquisite naturalness of their execution, till they have seen the living beetle at its work. In Nubia, where the strip of cultivable land is generally but a few feet in breadth, the scarab's task is comparatively light, and the breed multiplies freely. But in Egypt he often has a wide plain to traverse with his burden, and is therefore scarce in proportion to the difficulty with which he maintains the struggle for existence. The scarab race in Egypt would seem to have diminished very considerably since the days of the Pharaohs, and the time is not perhaps far distant when the naturalist will look in vain for specimens on this side of the First Cataract. As far as my own experience goes, I can only say that I saw scores of these beetles during the Nubian part of the journey, but that to the best of my recollection this was the only occasion upon which I observed one in Egypt. The Nile makes 4 or 5 more great bends between Gebel Abu Feda and Siout, passing Manfalut by the way, which town lies some distance back from the shore. All things taken into consideration, the fitful wind that came and went continually, the tremendous zigzags of the river, the dead calm which befell us when only 8 miles from Siout, and the long day of tracking that followed, with the town in sight the whole way, we thought ourselves fortunate to get in by the evening of the 3rd day after the storm. Those last 8 miles are, however, for open, placid beauty, as lovely in their way as anything north of Thebes. The valley is here very wide and fertile. The town, with its multitudinous minarets, appears first on one side and then on the other, according to the windings of the river. The distant, pinky mountains look almost as transparent as the air or the sunshine, while the banks unfold an endless succession of charming little subjects, every one of which looks as if it asked to be sketched as we pass. A shadoof and a clump of palms, a triad of shaggy black buffaloes up to their shoulders in the river, and dozing as they stand, a wide-spreading sycamore fig, in the shadow of which lie a man and a camel asleep, a fallen palm, uprooted by the last inundation, with its fibrous roots yet clinging to the bank and its crest in the water, a group of sheikhs' tombs with glistening white cupolas relieved against a background of dark foliage, an old, disused water-wheel lying up sideways against the bank like a huge teetotum, and garlanded with wild tendrils of a gourd. Such are a few out of many bits by the way, which, if they offer nothing very new, at least at all events present the old material under fresh aspects, and in combination with a distance of such ethereal light and shade, and such opalescent tenderness of tone, that it looks more like an air-drawn mirage than a piece of the world we live in. Like a mirage, too, that fairy town of Siout seemed always to hover at the same unattainable distance, and after hours of tracking to be no nearer than at first. Sometimes, indeed, following the long reaches of the river, we appeared to be leaving it behind, and although, as I have said, we had 8 miles of hard work to get to it, I doubt whether it was ever more than 3 miles distant, as the bird flies. It was late in the afternoon, however, when we turned the last corner, and the sun was already setting when the boat reached the village of Hamra, which is the mooring place for Siout. Siout itself, with clustered cupolas and arrowy minarets, lying back in the plain at the foot of a great mountain pierced with tombs. Now it was in the bond that our crew were to be allowed 24 hours for making and baking bread at Siout, Esna, and Aswan. No sooner, therefore, was the dahabeah moored than Rais Hassan and the steersman started away at full speed on 2 little donkeys to buy flour, while Mehemet Ali, one of our most active and intelligent sailors, rushed off to hire the oven. For here, at Esna and Aswan, there are large flour stores and public bakehouses for the use of sailors on the river, who make and bake their bread in large lots, cut it into slices, dry it in the sun, and preserve it in the form of rusks for months together. Thus prepared, it takes the place of ship biscuit, and it is so far superior to ship biscuit that it neither molds nor breeds the maggot, but remains good and wholesome to the last crumb. Chapter 6. Minia to Siout, Part 3. Siout, frequently written Asyut, is the capital of Middle Egypt, and has the best bazaars of any town up the Nile. Its red and black pottery is famous throughout the country, and its pipe bowls, supposed to be the best in Egypt, being largely exported to Cairo, find their way not only to all parts of the Levant, but to every Algerine and Japanese shop in London and Paris. No lover of peasant pottery will yet have forgotten the Egyptian stalls in the ceramic gallery of the International Exhibition of 1871. All those quaint red vases and lustrous black tazzas, all those exquisite little coffee services, those crocodile paperweights, those barrel-shaped and bird-shaped bottles came from Siout. There is a whole street of such pottery here in the town. Your dahabeah is scarcely made fast before a dealer comes on board and ranges his brittle wares along the deck. Others display their goods upon the bank. But the best things are only to be had in the bazaar, and not even in Cairo is it possible to find Siout ware so choice in color, form, and design as that which the 2 or 3 best dealers bring out, wrapped in soft paper, when a European customer appears in the market. Besides the street of pottery, there is a street of red shoes, another of native and foreign stuffs, and the usual run of saddlers' shops, kebab stalls, and Greek stores for the sale of everything in heaven or earth, from third-rate cognac to patent wax vestas. The houses are of plastered mud or sun-dried bricks, as at Minia. The thoroughfares are dusty, narrow, unpaved, and crowded, as at Minia. The people are one-eyed, dirty, and unfragrant, as at Minia. The children's eyes are full of flies, and their heads are covered with sores, as at Minia. In short, it is Minia over again on a larger scale, differing only in respect of its inhabitants, who, instead of being sullen, thievish, and unfriendly, are too familiar to be pleasant, and the most unappeasable beggars out of Ireland. So our mirage turns to sordid reality, and Siout, which from afar off looked like the capital of dreamland, resolves itself into a big mud town as ugly and ordinary as its fellows. Even the minarets, so elegant from a distance, betray for the most part but rough masonry and clumsy ornamentation when looked closely into. A lofty embanked road, planted with fine sycamore figs, leads from Hamra to Siout, and another embanked road leads from Siout to the Mountain of Tombs. Of the ancient Egyptian city no vestige remains, the modern town being built upon the mounds of the earlier settlement, but the city of the dead, so much of it at least as was excavated in the living rock, survives, as at Memphis, to commemorate the departed splendor of the place. We took donkeys next day to the edge of the desert, and went up to the sepulchres on foot. The mountain, which looked a delicate salmon pink when seen from afar, now showed bleached and arid and streaked with ochreous yellow. Layer above layer, in beds of strongly marked stratification, it towered overhead. Tier above tier, the tombs yawned, open-mouthed, along the face of the precipice. I picked up a fragment of the rock, and found it light, porous, and full of little cells like pumice. The slopes were strewn with such stones, as well as with fragments of mummy, shreds of mummy cloth, and human bones, all whitening and withering in the sun. The first tomb we came to was the so-called Stable Anter, a magnificent but cruelly mutilated excavation, consisting of a grand entrance, a vaulted corridor, a great hall, 2 side chambers, and a sanctuary. The ceiling of the corridor, now smoke-blackened and defaced, has been richly decorated with intricate patterns in light green, white, and buff, upon a ground of dark bluish-green stucco. The wall to the right on entering is covered with a long hieroglyphic inscription. In the sanctuary vague traces of seated figures, male and female, with lotus blossoms in their hands, are dimly visible. 2 colossal warriors incised in outline upon the levelled rock, the one very perfect, the other hacked almost out of recognition, stand on each side of the huge portal. A circular hole in the threshold marks the spot where the great door once worked upon its pivot, and a deep pit, now partially filled in with rubbish, leads from the centre of the hall to some long rifled vault deep down in the heart of the mountain. Wilful destruction has been at work on every side. The wall sculptures are chipped and defaced, the massive pillars that once supported the superincumbent rock have been carried away, the interior is heaped high with debris. Enough is left, however, to attest the antique stateliness of the tomb, and the hieroglyphic inscription remains almost intact to tell its age and history. This inscription, erroneously entered in Murray's Guide as uncopied, but interpreted by Bruges, who published extracts from it as far back as 1862, shows the excavation to have been made for one Hepukepha, or Haptepha, nomarch of the Lycopolite nome, and chief priest of the jackal god of Siout. It is also famous among scientific students for certain passages which contain important information regarding the intercalary days of the Egyptian calendar. We observed that the full-length figures on the jambs of the doorway appeared to have been incised, filled in with stucco, and then colored. The stucco had for the most part fallen out, though enough remained to show the style of the work. From this tomb to the next we crept by way of a passage, tunneled in the mountain, and emerged into a spacious quadrangular grotto, even more dilapidated than the first. It had been originally supported by square pillars left standing in the substance of the rock, but like the pillars in the tomb of Hepukepha, they had been hewn away in the middle and looked like stalactite columns in the process of formation. For the rest, 2 half-filled pits, a broken sarcophagus, and a few painted hieroglyphs upon a space of stuccoed wall were all that remained. One would have liked to see the sepulchre in which Ampere, the brilliant and eager disciple of Champollion, deciphered the ancient name of Siout, but since he does not specify the cartouche by which it could be identified, one might wander about the mountain for a week without being able to find it. Having first described the Stable Anter, he says, "In another grotto I found twice over the name of the city written in hieroglyphic characters, Siout. This name forms part of an inscription which also contains an ancient royal cartouche, so proving that the present name of the city dates back to pharaonic times." Here, then, we trace a double process of preservation. This town, which in the ancient Egyptian was written Siut, became Lycopolis under the Greeks, continued to be called Lycopolis throughout the period of Roman rule in Egypt, reverted to its old historic name under the Copts of the Middle Ages, who wrote it Siut, and survives in the Asyut of the Arab Fellah. Nor is this by any means a solitary instance. Chemis in the same way became Panopolis, reverted to the Coptic Kimin, and to this day as Ekmim perpetuates the legend of its first foundation. As with these fragments of the old tongue, so with the race. Subdued again and again by invading hordes, intermixed for centuries together with Phoenician, Persian, Greek, Roman, and Arab blood, it fuses these heterogeneous elements in one common mold, reverts persistently to the early type, and remains Egyptian to the last. So strange is the tyranny of natural forces. The sun and soil of Egypt demand one special breed of men, and will tolerate no other. Foreign residents cannot rear children in the country. In the Isthmus of Suez, which is considered the healthiest part of Egypt, an alien population of 20,000 persons failed in the course of 10 years to rear one infant born upon the soil. Children of an alien father and an Egyptian mother will die off in the same way in early infancy, unless brought up in simple native fashion. And it is affirmed of the descendants of mixed marriages that after the third generation the foreign blood seems to be eliminated, while the traits of the race are restored in their original purity. These are but a few instances of the startling conservatism of Egypt, a conservatism which interested me particularly, and to which I shall frequently have occasion to return. Each nome or province of ancient Egypt had its sacred animal, and Siut was called Lycopolis by the Greeks because the wolf, now almost extinct in the land, was there held in the same kind of reverence as the cat at Bubastis, the crocodile at Ombus, and the lion at Leontopolis. Mummy wolves are, or used to be, found in the smaller tombs about the mountain, as well as mummy jackals, Anubis, the jackal-headed god, being the presiding deity of the district. A mummied jackal from this place, curiously wrapped in striped bandages, is to be seen in the first Egyptian room at the British Museum. But the view from the mountains above Siut is finer than its tombs and more ancient than its mummies. Seen from within the great doorway of the second grotto, it looks like a framed picture. For the foreground we have a dazzling slope of limestone debris. In the middle distance a wide plain clothed with the delicious tender green of very young corn. Farther away yet, the cupolas and minarets of Siut rising from the midst of a belt of palm groves. Beyond those again, the molten gold of the great river glittering away coil after coil into the far distance, and all along the horizon the everlasting boundary of the desert. Large pools of placid water left by the last inundation lie here and there, like lakes amid the green. A group of brown men are waiting yonder with their nets. A funeral comes along the embanked road, the bier carried at a rapid pace on men's shoulders, and covered with a red shawl, the women taking up handfuls of dust and scattering it upon their heads as they walk. We can see the dust flying, and hear their shrill wail borne upon the breathless air. The cemetery towards which they are going lies round to the left, at the foot of the mountain, a wilderness of little white cupolas, with here and there a tree. Broad spaces of shade sleep under the spreading sycamores by the roadside, a hawk circles overhead, and Siut, bathed in the splendor of the morning sun, looks as fairy-like as ever. Lepsius is reported to have said that the view from this hillside was the finest in Egypt. But Egypt is a long country, and questions of precedence are delicate matters to deal with. It is, however, a very beautiful view, though most travelers who know the scenery about Thebes and the approach to Aswan would hesitate, I should fancy, to give the preference to a landscape from which the nearer mountains are excluded by the position of the spectator. The tombs here, as in many other parts of Egypt, are said to have been largely appropriated by early Christian anchorites during the reigns of the later Roman emperors, and to these recluses may perhaps be ascribed the legend that makes Lycopolis the abode of Joseph and Mary, during the years of their sojourn in Egypt. It is, of course, but a legend, and wholly improbable. If the Holy Family ever journeyed into Egypt at all, which certain biblical critics now hold to be doubtful, they probably rested from their wanderings at some town not very far from the eastern border, as Tanis, Pithom, or Bubastis. Siout would, at all events, lie at least 250 miles to the southward of any point to which they might reasonably be supposed to have penetrated. Still, one would like to believe a story that laid the scene of our Lord's childhood in the midst of this beautiful and glowing Egyptian pastoral. With what profound and touching interest it would invest the place! With what different eyes we should look down upon a landscape which must have been dear and familiar to him in all its details, and which, from the nature of the ground, must have remained almost unchanged from his day to ours! The mountain, with its tombs, the green cornflats, the Nile and the desert, looked then as they look now. It is only the Moslem minarets that are new. It is only the pylons and sanctuaries of the ancient worship that have passed away. Chapter 7. Siout to Dendera, Part 1. We started from Siout with a couple of tons of new brown bread on board, which, being cut into slices and laid to dry in the sun, was speedily converted into rusks and stored away in 2 huge lockers on the upper deck. The sparrows and water wagtails had a good time while the drying went on, but no one seemed to grudge the toll they levied. We often had a big wind now, though it seldom began to blow before 10 or 11 a.m., and generally fell at sunset. Now and then, when it chanced to keep up, and the river was known to be free from shallows, we went on sailing through the night, but this seldom happened, and when it did happen, it made sleep impossible, so that nothing but the certainty of doing a great many miles between bedtime and breakfast could induce us to put up with it. We had now been long enough afloat to find out that we had almost always one man on the sick list, and were therefore habitually short of a hand for the navigation of the boat. There never were such fellows for knocking themselves to pieces as our sailors. They were always bruising their feet, wounding their hands, getting sunstrokes and whitlows and sprains, and disabling themselves in some way. Elle, with her little medicine chest and her roll of lint and bandages, soon had a small but steady practice, and might have been seen about the lower deck most mornings after breakfast, repairing those damaged Alis and Hassans. It was well for them that we carried an experienced surgeon, for they were entirely helpless and despondent when hurt, and ignorant of the commonest remedies. Nor is this helplessness confined to natives of the sailor and fellah class. The provincial proprietors and officials are to the full as ignorant, not only of the uses of such simple things as poultices or wet compresses, but of the most elementary laws of health. Doctors there are none south of Cairo, and such is the general mistrust of state medicine, that when, as in the case of any widely spread epidemic, a medical officer is sent up the river by order of the government, half the people are said to conceal their sick, while the other half reject the remedies prescribed for them. Their trust in the skill of the passing European is, on the other hand, unbounded. Appeals for advice and medicine were constantly being made to us by both rich and poor, and there was something very pathetic in the simple faith with which they accepted any little help we were able to give them. Meanwhile, Elle's medical reputation, being confirmed by a few simple cures, rose high among the crew. They called her the Hakim Sit, the doctor lady, obeyed her directions and swallowed her medicines as reverently as if she were the College of Surgeons personified, and showed their gratitude in all kinds of pretty childlike ways, singing her favourite Arab song as they ran beside her donkey, searching for sculptured fragments whenever there were ruins to be visited, and constantly bringing her little gifts of pebbles and wild flowers. Above Siout, the picturesqueness of the river is confined for the most part to the eastern bank. We have almost always a near range of mountains on the Arabian side, and a more distant chain on the Libyan horizon. Gebel Sheikh Aranyes succeeds to Gebel Abu Faida, and is followed in close succession by the cliffs of Gao, of Gebel Sheikh el Haridi, of Gebel Aseret and Gebel Touk, all alike rigid in strongly marked beds of level limestone strata, flat-topped and even, like lines of giant ramparts, and more or less pierced with orifices which we know to be tombs, but which look like loopholes from a distance. Flying before the wind with both sails set, we see the rapid panorama unfold itself day after day, mile after mile, hour after hour. Villages, palm groves, rock-cut sepulchres flit past and are left behind. Today we enter the region of the dome palm. Tomorrow we pass the map-drawn limit of the crocodile. The cliffs advance, recede, open away into desolate-looking valleys, and show faint traces of paths leading to excavated tombs on distant heights. The headland that looked shadowy in the distance a couple of hours ago is reached and passed. The cargo boat on which we have been gaining all the morning is outstripped and dwindling in the rear. Now we pass a bold bluff sheltering a sheikh's tomb and a solitary dome palm. Now an ancient quarry from which the stone has been cut out in smooth masses, leaving great halls and corridors and stages in the mountainside. At Gao, the scene of an insurrection headed by a crazy dervish some 10 years ago, we see, in place of a large and populous village, only a tract of fertile corn ground, a few ruined huts, and a group of decapitated palms. We are now skirting Gebel Sheikh el Haridi, here bordered by a rich margin of cultivated flat, yonder leaving space for scarce a strip of roadway between the precipice and the river. Then comes Rania, a large village of square mud towers, lofty and battlemented, with string courses of pots for the pigeons, and later on, Gerga, once the capital town of Middle Egypt, where we put in for half an hour to post and inquire for letters. Here the Nile is fast eating away the bank and carrying the town by storm. A ruined mosque with pointed arches, roofless cloisters, and a leaning column that must surely have come to the ground by this time, stands just above the landing place. 100 years ago it lay a quarter of a mile from the river. 10 years ago it was yet perfect. After a few more inundations it will be swept away. Till that time comes, however, it helps make Gerga one of the most picturesque towns in Egypt. At Farshut we see the sugar works in active operation. Smoke pouring from the tall chimneys, steam issuing from the traps in the basement, cargo boats unlading fresh sugar cane against the bank, heavily burdened Arabs transporting it to the factory, bullock trucks laden with cane leafing for firing. A little higher up, at Sahil Bajura on the opposite side of the river, we find the bank strewn for a full quarter of a mile with sugar cane en masse. Hundreds of camels are either arriving laden with it or going back for more, dozens of cargo boats are drawn up to receive it, swarms of brown fellahin are stacking it on board for unshipment again at Farshut. The camels snort and growl, the men shout, the overseers, in blue-fringed robes and white turbans, stalk to and fro and keep the work going. The mountains here recede so far as to be almost out of sight, and a plain rich in sugar cane and date palms widens out between them and the river. And now the banks are lovely with an unwonted wealth of verdure. The young corn clothes the plain like a carpet, while the yellow tasselled mimosa, the feathery tamarisk, the dome and the date palm, and the spreading sycamore fig border the towing path like garden trees beside a garden walk. Farther on still, when all this greenery is left behind and the banks have again become flat and bare, we see to our exceeding surprise what seems to be a very large grizzled ape, perched on the top of a dust heap on the western bank. The creature is evidently quite tame, and sits on his haunches in just that chilly, melancholy posture that the chimpanzee is wont to assume in his cage at the Zoological Gardens. Some 6 or 8 Arabs, one of whom has dismounted from his camel for the purpose, are standing round and staring at him, much as the British public stands round and stares at the specimen in Regent's Park. Meanwhile a strange excitement breaks out among our crew. They crowd to the side, they shout, they gesticulate, the captain salaams, the steersman waves his hand, all eyes are turned towards the shore. "Do you see Sheikh Salim?" cries Ptolemy breathlessly, rushing up from below. "There he is! Look at him! That is Sheikh Salim!" And so we find out that it is not a monkey but a man, and not only a man but a saint. Holiest of the holy, dirtiest of the dirty, white-pated, white-bearded, withered, bent, and knotted up, is the renowned Sheikh Salim, he who, naked and unwashed, has sat on that same spot every day through summer heat and winter cold for the last 50 years, never providing himself with food or water, never even lifting his hand to his mouth, depending on charity not only for his food but for his feeding. He is not nice to look at, even by this dim light and at this distance, but the sailors think him quite beautiful, and call aloud to him for his blessing as we go by. "It is not by our own will that we sail past, O father," they cry. "Fain would we kiss thy hand, but the wind blows and the merkib boat goes, and we have no power to stay." But Sheikh Salim neither lifts his hand nor shows any sign of hearing, and in a few minutes the mound on which he sits is left behind in the gloaming. At Hao, where the new town is partly built on the mounds of the old, Diospolis Parva, we next morning saw the natives transporting small boat-loads of ancient brick rubbish to the opposite side of the river, for the purpose of manuring those fields from which the early Dura crop had just been gathered in. Thus, curiously enough, the mud left by some inundation of 2,000 or 3,000 years ago comes at last to the use from which it was then diverted, and is found to be more fertilizing than the new deposit. At Kezer el Said, a little farther on, we came to one of the well-known bad bits, a place where the bed of the river is full of sunken rocks, and sailing is impossible. Here the men were half the day punting the dahabeah over the dangerous part, while we grubbed among the mounds of what was once the ancient city of Chenobasian. These remains, which cover a large superficial area and consist entirely of crude brick foundations, are very interesting and in good preservation. We traced the ground plans of several houses, followed the passages by which they were separated, and observed many small arches which seemed built on too small a scale for doors or windows, but for which it was difficult to account in any other way. Brambles and weeds were growing in these deserted enclosures, while rubbish heaps, excavated pits, and piles of broken pottery divided the ruins and made the work of exploration difficult. We looked in vain for the dilapidated quay and sculptured blocks mentioned in Wilkinson's General View of Egypt, but if the foundation stones of the sugar factory close against the mooring place could speak, they would no doubt explain the mystery. We saw nothing, indeed, to show that Chenobasian had contained any stone structures whatever, save the broken shaft of one small granite column. The village of Kezer es Said consists of a cluster of mud huts and a sugar factory, but the factory was idle that day, and the village seemed half deserted. The view here is particularly fine. About a couple of miles to the southward, the mountains, in magnificent procession, came down again at right angles to the river, and thence reach away in long ranges of precipitous headlands. The plain, terminating abruptly against the foot of this gigantic barrier, opens back eastward to the remotest horizon, an undulating sea of glistening sand, bordered by a chaotic middle distance of mounded ruins. Nearest of all, a narrow foreground of cultivated soil, green with young crops and watered by frequent shadoofs, extends along the riverside to the foot of the mountain. A sheikh's tomb shaded by a single dome palm is conspicuous on the bank, while far away, planted amid the solitary weeds, we see a large Coptic convent with many cupolas, a cemetery full of Christian graves, and a little oasis of date palms indicating the presence of a spring. The chief interest of this scene, however, centres in the ruins, and these, looked upon from a little distance, blackened, desolate, half-buried, obscured every now and then, when the wind swept over them by swirling clouds of dust, reminded us of the villages we had seen not 2 years before, half overwhelmed and yet smoking in the midst of a lava torrent below Vesuvius. We had now the full moon again, making night more beautiful than day. Sitting on deck for hours after the sun had gone down, when the boat glided gently on with half-filled sail and the force of the wind was spent, we used to wonder if in all the world there was another climate in which the effect of moonlight was so magical. To say that every object, far or near, was visible as distinctly as by day, yet more tenderly, is to say nothing. It was not only form that was defined, it was not only light and shadow that were vivid, it was colour that was present. Colour neither deadened nor changed, but softened, glowing, spiritualized. The amber sheen of the sand island in the middle of the river, the sober green of the palm grove, the little lady's turquoise-coloured hood were clear to the sight and relatively true in tone. The oranges showed through the bars of the crate like nuggets of pure gold. Elle's crimson shawl glowed with a warmer dye than it ever wore by day. The mountains were flushed as if in the light of sunset. Of all the natural phenomena that we beheld in the course of the journey, I remember none that surprised us more than this. We could scarcely believe at first that it was not some effect of afterglow, or some miraculous aurora of the east. But the sun had nothing to do with that flush upon the mountains. The glow was in the stone, and the moonlight but revealed the local colour. For some days before they came in sight we had been eagerly looking for the Theban hills, and now, after a night of rapid sailing, we woke one morning to find the sun rising on the wrong side of the boat, the favourable wind dead against us, and a picturesque chain of broken peaks upon our starboard bow. By these signs we knew that we must have come to the great bend in the river between Howe and Kenna, and that these new mountains, so much more varied in form than those of Middle Egypt, must be the mountains behind Dendera. They seemed to lie upon the eastern bank, but that was an illusion which the map disproved, and which lasted only till the great corner was fairly turned. To turn that corner, however, in the teeth of wind and current, was no easy task, and cost us 2 long days of hard tracking. Chapter 7. Siout to Dendera, Part 2. At a point about 10 miles below Dendera we saw some thousands of fellaheen at work amid clouds of sand upon the embankments of a new canal. They swarmed over the mounds like ants, and the continuous murmur of their voices came to us across the river like the humming of innumerable bees. Others, following the path along the bank, were pouring towards the spot in an unbroken stream. The Nile must here be nearly half a mile in breadth, but the engineers in European dress, and the overseers with long sticks in their hands, were plainly distinguishable by the help of a glass. The tents in which these officials were camping out during the progress of the work gleamed white among the palms by the riverside. Such scenes must have been common enough in the old days when a conquering Pharaoh, returning from Libya or the land of Cush, set his captives to raise a dike, or excavate a lake, or quarry a mountain. The Israelites building the massive walls of Pithom and Ramesses with bricks of their own making must have presented exactly such a spectacle. That we were witnessing a case of forced labour could not be doubted. Those thousands yonder had most certainly been drafted off in gangs from hundreds of distant villages, and were but little better off for the time being than the captives of the ancient empire. In all cases of forced labour, under the present regime, however, it seems that the labourer is paid, though very insufficiently, for his unwilling toil, and that his captivity only lasts so long as the work for which he has been pressed remains in progress. In some cases the term of service is limited to 3 or 4 months, at the end of which time the men are supposed to be returned in barges towed by government steam tugs. It too often happens, nevertheless, that the poor souls are left to get back how they can, and thus many a husband and father either perishes by the way or is driven to take service in some village far from home. Meanwhile his wife and children, being scantily supported by the Sheikh el Beled, fall into a condition of semi-serfdom, and his little patch of ground, left untilled through seed time and harvest, passes after the next inundation into the hands of a stranger. But there is another side to this question of forced labour. Water must be had in Egypt, no matter at what cost. If the land is not sufficiently irrigated, the crops fail and the nation starves. Now the frequent construction of canals has from immemorial time been reckoned among the first duties of an Egyptian ruler, but it is a duty which cannot be performed without the willing or unwilling cooperation of several thousand workmen. Those who are best acquainted with the character and temper of the fellah maintain the hopelessness of looking to him for voluntary labor of this description. Frugal, patient, easily contented as he is, no promise of wages, however high, would tempt him from his native village. What to him are the needs of a district 600 or 700 miles away? His own shadoof is enough for his own patch, and so long as he can raise his 3 little crops a year, neither he nor his family will starve. How then are these necessary public works to be carried out, unless by means of the corvée? Mishrabu has put an ingenious summary of this other side argument into the mouth of his ideal fellah. It is not the emperor, says Ahmed to the Frenchman, who causes the rain to descend upon your lands. It is the west wind, and the benefit thus conferred upon you exacts no penalty of manual labor. But in Egypt, where the rain from heaven falls scarcely 3 times in the year, it is the prince who supplies its place to us by distributing the waters of the Nile. This can only be done by the work of men's hands, and it is therefore to the interest of all that the hands of all should be at his disposal. We regard it, I think, as an especial piece of good fortune, when we found ourselves becalmed the next day within 3 or 4 miles of Denderah. Abydos comes first in order according to the map, but then the temples lie 7 or 8 miles from the river, and as we happened just thereabouts to be making some 10 miles an hour, we put off the excursion till our return. Here, however, the ruins lay comparatively near at hand, and in such a position that we could approach them from below and rejoin our dahabeah a few miles higher up the river. So, leaving Rais Hassan to track against the current, we landed at the first convenient point, and finding neither donkeys nor guides at hand, took an escort of 3 or 4 sailors and set off on foot. The way was long, the day was hot, and we had only the map to go by. Having climbed the steep bank and skirted an extensive palm grove, we found ourselves in a country without paths or roads of any kind. The soil, squared off as usual like a gigantic chessboard, was traversed by hundreds of tiny water channels, between which we had to steer our course as best we could. Presently the last belt of palms was passed. The plain, green with young corn and level as a lake, widened out to the front of the mountains, and the temple, islanded in that sea of rippling emerald, rose up before us upon its platform of blackened mounds. It was still full 2 miles away, but it looked enormous, showing from this distance as a massive, low-browed, sharply defined mass of dead white masonry. The walls sloped in slightly towards the top, and the façade appeared to be supported on 8 square piers, with a large doorway in the centre. If sculptured ornament or cornice or pictured legend enriched these walls, we were too far off to distinguish them. All looked strangely naked and solemn, more like a tomb than a temple. Nor was the surrounding scene less deathlike in its solitude. Not a tree, not a hut, not a living form broke the green monotony of the plain. Behind the temple, but divided from it by a farther space of mounded ruins, those mountains, pinky, aerial, with sheeny sand-drifts heaped in the hollows of their bare buttresses, and spaces of soft blue shadow in their misty chasms. Where the range receded, a long vista of glittering desert opened to the Libyan horizon. Then, as we drew nearer, coming by and by to a raised causeway which apparently connected the mounds with some point down by the river, the details of the temple gradually emerged into distinctness. We could now see the curve and undershadow of the cornice, and a small object in front of the façade, which looked at first like a monolithic altar, resolved itself into a massive gateway of the kind known as a single pylon. Nearer still, among some low outlying mounds, we came upon fragments of sculptured capitals and mutilated statues half buried in rank grass, upon a series of stagnant neater tanks and deserted workshops, upon the telegraph poles and wires which here come striding along the edge of the desert and vanish southward with messages for Nubia and the Sudan. Egypt is the land of neater. It is found wherever a crude brick mound is disturbed or an antique stone structure demolished. The Nile mud is strongly impregnated with it, and in Nubia we used to find it lying in thick talc-like flakes upon the surface of rocks far above the present level of the inundation. These tanks at Dendera had been sunk, we were told, when the great temple was excavated by Abbas Pasha more than 20 years ago. The niter then found was utilized out of hand, washed and crystallized in the tanks, and converted into gunpowder in the adjacent workshops. The telegraph wires are more recent intruders, and the work of the Khedive, but one longed to put them out of sight, to pull down the gunpowder sheds, and to fill up the tanks with debris. For what had the arts of modern warfare, or the wonders of modern science, to do with Hathor, the Lady of Beauty and the Western Shades, the nurse of Horus, the Egyptian Aphrodite, to whom yonder mountain of wrought stone and all these wastes were sacred? We were by this time near enough to see that the square piers of the facade were neither square nor piers, but huge round columns with human-headed capitals, and that the walls, instead of being plain and tomb-like, were covered with an infinite multitude of sculptured figures. The pylon, rich with inscriptions and bas-reliefs, but disfigured by myriads of tiny wasps' nests, like clustered mud bubbles, now towered high above our heads, and led to a walled avenue cut direct through the mounds, and sloping downwards to the main entrance of the temple. Not, however, till we stood immediately under those ponderous columns, looking down upon the paved floor below, and up to the huge cornice that projected overhead like the crest of an impending wave, did we realize the immense proportions of the building. Lofty as it looked from a distance, we now found that it was only the interior that had been excavated, and that not more than 2/3 of its actual height were visible above the mounds. The level of the avenue was, indeed, at its lowest part full 20 feet above that of the first great hall, and we had still a deep temporary staircase to go down before reaching the original pavement. The effect of the portico as one stands at the top of the staircase is one of overwhelming majesty. Its breadth, its height, the massiveness of its parts exceed in grandeur all that one has been anticipating throughout the long 2 miles of approach. The immense girth of the columns, the huge screens which connect them, the ponderous cornice jutting overhead, confuse the imagination, and in the absence of given measurements appear perhaps even more enormous than they are. Looking up to the architrave, we see a kind of Egyptian Panathenaic procession of carven priests and warriors, some with standards and some with musical instruments. The winged globe, depicted upon a gigantic scale in the curve of the cornice, seems to hover above the central doorway. Hieroglyphs, emblems, strange forms of kings and gods cover every foot of wall space, frieze, and pillar. Nor does this wealth of surface sculpture tend in any way to diminish the general effect of size. It would seem, on the contrary, as if complex decorations were in this instance the natural complement to the simplicity of form. Every group, every inscription appears to be necessary and in its place, an essential part of the building it helps to adorn. Most of these details are as perfect as on the day when the last workman went his way, and the architect saw his design completed. Time has neither marred the surface of the stone nor blunted the work of the chisel. Such injury as they have sustained is from the hand of man, and in no country has the hand of man achieved more and destroyed more than in Egypt. The Persians overthrew the masterpieces of the Pharaohs, the Copts mutilated the temples of the Ptolemies and Caesars, the Arabs stripped the pyramids and carried Memphis away piecemeal. Here, at Dendera, we have an example of Greco-Egyptian work and early Christian fanaticism. Begun by Ptolemy XI, and bearing upon its latest ovals the name and style of Nero, the present building was still comparatively new when, in A.D. 379, the ancient religion was abolished by the edict of Theodosius. It was then the most gorgeous, as well as the most recent, of all those larger temples built during the prosperous foreign rule of the last 700 years. It stood surrounded by groves of palm and acacia, within the precincts of a vast enclosure, the walls of which, 1,000 feet in length, 35 feet high and 15 feet thick, are still traceable. A dromos, now buried under 20 feet of debris, led from the pylon to the portico. The pylon is there still, a partial ruin, but the temple, with its roof, its staircases, and its secret treasure crypts, is in all essential respects as perfect as on the day when its splendor was given over to the spoilers. One can easily imagine how those spoilers sacked and ravaged all before them, how they desecrated the sacred places and cast down the statues of the goddess, and divided the treasures of the sanctuary. They did not, it is true, commit such wholesale destruction as the Persian invaders of 900 years before, but they were merciless iconoclasts, and hacked away the face of every figure within easy reach, both inside and outside the building. Among those which escaped, however, is the famous external bas-relief of Cleopatra on the back of the temple. This curious sculpture is now banked up with rubbish for its better preservation, and can no longer be seen by travellers. It was, however, admirably photographed some years ago by Signor Beati, which photograph is faithfully reproduced in the annexed engraving. Cleopatra is here represented with a headdress combining the attributes of three goddesses, namely the vulture of Maut, the head of which is modelled in a masterly way, the horned disk of Hathor, and the throne of Isis. The falling mass below the headdress is intended to represent hair dressed according to the Egyptian fashion, in an infinite number of small plaits, each finished off with an ornamental tag. The women of Egypt and Nubia wear their hair so to this day, and unplait it, I am sorry to say, not oftener than once in every 8 or 10 weeks. The Nubian girls fasten each separate tail with a lump of Nile mud daubed over with yellow ochre, but Queen Cleopatra's silken tresses were probably tipped with gilded wax or gum. It is difficult to know where decorative sculpture ends and portraiture begins in a work of this epoch. We cannot even be certain that a portrait was intended, though the introduction of the royal oval in which the name of Cleopatra is spelt with its vowel sounds in full would seem to point that way. If it is a portrait, then large allowance must be made for conventional treatment. The fleshiness of the features and the intolerable simper are common to every head of the Ptolemaic period. The ear, too, is pattern work, and the drawing of the figure is ludicrous. Mannerism apart, however, the face wants for neither individuality nor beauty. Cover the mouth, and you have an almost faultless profile. The chin and throat are also quite lovely, while the whole face, suggestive of cruelty, subtlety, and voluptuousness, carries with it an indefinable impression not only of portraiture but of likeness. It is not without something like a shock that one first sees the unsightly havoc wrought upon the Hathor-headed columns of the façade at Dendera. The massive folds of headgear are there. The ears, erect and pointed like those of a heifer, are there, but of the benignant face of the goddess not a feature remains. Ampere, describing these columns in one of his earliest letters from Egypt, speaks of them as being still brilliant with colors that time had no power to efface. Time, however, must have been unusually busy during the 30 years that have gone by since then, for though we presently found several instances of painted bas-reliefs in the small inner chambers, I do not remember to have observed any remains of color, save here and there a faint trace of yellow ochre, on the external decorations. Chapter 7. Siut to Dendera, Part 3. Without, all was sunshine and splendor. Within, all was silence and mystery. A heavy, death-like smell, as of long imprisoned gases, met us on the threshold. By the half-light that strayed in through the portico, we could see vague outlines of a forest of giant columns rising out of the gloom below and vanishing into the gloom above. Beyond these again appeared shadowy vistas of successive halls leading away into depths of impenetrable darkness. It required no great courage to go down those stairs and explore those depths with a party of fellow travellers, but it would have been a gruesome place to venture into alone. Seen from within, the portico shows as a vast hall, 50 feet in height and supported on 24 Hathor-headed columns. 6 of these, being engaged in the screen, form part of the façade, and are the same upon which we have been looking from without. By degrees, as our eyes become used to the twilight, we see here and there a capital which still preserves the vague likeness of a gigantic female face, while dimly visible on every wall, pillar, and doorway, a multitude of fantastic forms, hawk-headed, ibis-headed, cow-headed, mitred, plumed, holding aloft strange emblems, seated on thrones, performing mysterious rites, seem to emerge from their places, like things of life. Looking up to the ceiling, now smoke-blackened and defaced, we discover elaborate paintings of scarabaei, winged globes, and zodiacal emblems divided by borders of intricate Greek patterns, the prevailing colours of which are verdite and chocolate. Bands of hieroglyphic inscription, of royal ovals, of Hathor heads, of mitred hawks, of lion-headed chimeras, of divinities and kings in bas-relief, cover the shafts of the great columns from top to bottom, and even here every accessible face, however small, has been laboriously mutilated. Bewildered at first sight of these profuse and mysterious decorations, we wander round and around, going on from the first hall to the second, from the second to the third, and plunging into deeper darkness at every step. We have been reading about these gods and emblems for weeks past. We have studied the plan of the temple beforehand, yet now that we are actually here, our book knowledge goes for nothing, and we feel as hopelessly ignorant as if we had been suddenly landed in a new world. Not till we have got over this first feeling of confusion, not till, resting a while on the base of one of the columns, we again open out the plan of the building, do we begin to realize the purport of the sculptures by which we are surrounded. The ceremonial of Egyptian worship was essentially processional. Herein we have the central idea of every temple, and the key to its construction. It was bound to contain store chambers in which were kept vestments, instruments, divine emblems, and the like, laboratories for the preparation of perfumes and unguents, treasures for the safe custody of holy vessels and precious offerings, chambers for the reception and purification of tribute in kind, halls for the assembling and marshalling of priests and functionaries, and for processional purposes, corridors, staircases, courtyards, cloisters, and vast enclosures planted with avenues of trees and surrounded by walls which hedged in with inviolable secrecy the solemn rites of the priesthood. In this plan, it will be seen, there is no provision made for anything in the form of public worship. But then an Egyptian temple was not a place for public worship. It was a treasure house, a sacristy, a royal oratory, a place of preparation, of consecration, of sacerdotal privacy. There in costly shrines dwelt the divine images. There they were robed and unrobed, perfumed with incense, visited and worshipped by the king. On certain great days of the calendar, as on the occasion of the festival of the New Year, or the panegyrics of the local gods, these images were brought out, paraded along the corridors of the temple, carried round the roof, and borne with waving of banners and chanting of hymns and burning of incense through the sacred groves of the enclosure. Probably none were admitted to these ceremonies save persons of royal or priestly birth. To the rest of the community, all that took place within those massy walls was enveloped in mystery. It may be questioned, indeed, whether the great mass of people had any kind of personal religion. They may not have been rigidly excluded from the temple precincts, but they seem to have been allowed no participation in the worship of the gods. If now and then, on high festival days, they beheld the sacred bark of the deity carried in procession round the temenos, or caught a glimpse of moving figures and glittering ensigns in the pillared dusk of the hypostyle hall, it was all they ever beheld of the solemn services of their church. The temple of Dendera consists of a portico, a hall of entrance, a hall of assembly, a third hall which may be called the hall of the sacred boats, one small ground-floor chapel, and upwards of 20 side chambers of various sizes, most of which are totally dark. Each one of these halls and chambers bears the sculptured record of its use. Hundreds of tableaux in bas-relief, thousands of elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions cover every foot of available space on wall and ceiling and soffit, on doorway and column, and on the lining slabs of passages and staircases. These precious texts contain, amid much that is mystical and tedious, an extraordinary wealth of indirect history. Here we find programs of ceremonial observances, numberless legends of the gods, chronologies of kings with their various titles, registers of weights and measures, catalogues of offerings, recipes for the preparation of oils and essences, records of repairs and restorations done to the temple, geographical lists of cities and provinces, inventories of treasure, and the like. The Hall of Assembly contains a calendar of festivals, and sets forth with studied precision the rites to be performed on each recurring anniversary. On the ceiling of the portico we find an astronomical zodiac. On the walls of a small temple on the rood, the whole history of the resurrection of Osiris, together with the order of prayer for the 12 hours of the night, and a calendar of the festivals of Osiris in all the principal cities of Upper and Lower Egypt. 70 years ago these inscriptions were the puzzle and despair of the learned, but since modern science has plucked out the heart of its mystery, the whole temple lies before us an open volume filled to overflowing with strange and quaint and heterogeneous matter, a Talmud in sculptured stone. Given such help as Marryat's Handbook affords, one can trace out most of these curious things, and identify the uses of every hall and chamber throughout the building. The king, in the double character of Pharaoh and high priest, is the hero of every sculptured scene. Wearing sometimes the truncated crown of Lower Egypt, sometimes the helmet crown of Upper Egypt, and sometimes the shent, which is a combination of both, he figures in every tableau and heads every procession. Beginning with the sculptures of the portico, we see him arrive, preceded by his 5 royal standards. He wears his long robe, his sandals are on his feet, he carries his staff in his hand. 2 goddesses receive him at the door and conduct him into the presence of Thoth, the ibis-headed, and Horus, the hawk-headed, who pour upon him a double stream of the waters of life. Thus purified, he is crowned by the goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt, and by them consigned to the local deities of Thebes and Heliopolis, who usher him into the supreme presence of Hathor. He then presents various offerings and recites certain prayers, whereupon the goddess promises him length of days, everlasting renown, and other good things. We next see him, always with the same smile and always in the same attitude, doing homage to Osiris, to Horus, and other divinities. He presents them with flowers, wine, bread, incense, while they in return promise him life, joy, abundant harvests, victory, and the love of his people. These pretty speeches, chef d'oeuvre of diplomatic style and models of elegant flattery, are repeated over and over again in scores of hieroglyphic groups. Marryat, however, sees in them something more than the language of the court grafted upon the language of the hierarchy. He detects the language of the schools, and discovers in the utterances here ascribed to the king and the gods a reflection of that contemporary worship of the beautiful, the good, and the true, which characterized the teaching of the Alexandrian Museum. Passing on from the portico to the Hall of Assembly, we enter a region of still dimmer twilight, beyond which all is dark. In the side chambers, where the heat is intense and the atmosphere stifling, we can see only by the help of lighted candles. These rooms are about 20 feet in length, separate like prison cells, and perfectly dark. The sculptures which cover the walls are, however, as numerous as those in the outer halls, and indicate in each instance the purpose for which the room was designed. Thus, in the laboratories we find bas-reliefs of flasks and vases, and figures carrying perfume bottles of the familiar Arebalos form. In the tribute chambers, offerings of lotus lilies, wheat sheaves, maize, grapes, and pomegranates. In the oratories of Isis, Amen, and Sekhet, representations of these divinities enthroned and receiving the homage of the king, while in the treasury both king and queen appear laden with precious gifts of caskets, necklaces, pectoral ornaments, sistrums, and the like. It would seem that the image breakers had no time to spare for these dark cells, for here the faces and figures are unmutilated, and in some places even the original coloring remains in excellent preservation. The complexion of the goddesses, for instance, is painted of a light buff. The king's skin is dark red, that of Amen is blue. Isis wears a rich robe of the well-known Indian pine pattern. Sekhet figures in a many-colored garment curiously diapered. Amen is clad in red and green chain armor. The skirts of the goddesses are inconceivably scant, but they are rich in jewelry, and their headdresses, necklaces, and bracelets are full of minute and interesting detail. In one of the 4 oratories dedicated to Sekhet, the king is depicted in the act of offering a pectoral ornament of so rich and elegant a design that, had there been time and daylight, the writer would fain have copied it. In the center of the room at the extreme end of the temple, exactly opposite the main entrance, lies the oratory of Hathor. This dark chamber, into which no ray of daylight has ever penetrated, contains the sacred niche, the Holy of Holies, in which was kept the great golden sistrum of the goddess. The king alone was privileged to take out that mysterious emblem. Having done so, he enclosed it in a costly shrine, covered it with a thick veil, and placed it in one of the sacred boats of which we find elaborate representations sculptured on the walls of the hall in which they were kept. These boats, which were constructed of cedar wood, gold, and silver, were intended to be hoisted on wrought poles, and so carried in procession on the shoulders of the priests. The niche is still there, a mere hole in the wall some 3 feet square and about 8 feet from the ground. Thus, candle in hand, we make the circuit of these outer chambers. In each doorway, besides the place cut out for the bolt, we find a circular hole drilled above and a quadrant-shaped hollow below, where once upon a time the pivot of the door turned in its socket. The paved floors, torn up by treasure-seekers, are full of treacherous holes and blocks of broken stone. The ceilings are very lofty. In the corridors a dim twilight reigns, but all is pitch dark beyond these gloomy thresholds. Hurrying along by the light of a few flaring candles, one cannot but feel oppressed by the strangeness and awfulness of the place. We speak with bated breath, and even our chattering Arabs for once are silent. The very air tastes as if it had been imprisoned here for centuries. Finally, we take the staircase on the northern side of the temple, in order to go up to the roof. Nothing that we have yet seen surprises and delights us so much, I think, as this staircase. We had hitherto been tracing in their order all the preparations for a great religious ceremony. We have seen the king enter the temple, undergo the symbolical purification, receive the 2-fold crown, and say his prayers to each divinity in turn. We have followed him into the laboratories, the oratories, and the Holy of Holies. All that he has yet done, however, is preliminary. The procession is yet to come, and here we have it. Here, sculptured on the walls of this dark staircase, the crowning ceremony of Egyptian worship is brought before our eyes in all its details. Here, one by one, we have the standard-bearers, the hierophants with the offerings, the priests, the whole long, wonderful procession, with the king marching at its head. Fresh and uninjured as if they had but just left the hand of the sculptor, these figures, each in his habit as he lived, each with his foot upon the step, mount with us as we mount, and go beside us all the way. Their attitudes are so natural, their forms so roundly cut, that one could almost fancy them in motion as the lights flicker by. Surely there must be some one weird night in the year when they step out from their places and take up the next verse of their chanted hymn, and, to the sound of instruments long mute and songs long silent, pace the moonlit roof in ghastly order. The sun is already down, and the crimson light has faded, when at length we emerge upon that vast terrace. The roofing stones are gigantic, striding to and fro over some of the biggest. Our idle man finds several that measure 7 paces in length by 4 in breadth. In yonder distant corner, like a little stone lodge in a vast courtyard, stands a small temple supported on Hathor-headed columns, while at the eastern end, forming a second and loftier stage, rises the roof of the portico. Meanwhile the afterglow is fading. The mountains are yet clothed in an atmosphere of tender half-light, but mysterious shadows are fast creeping over the plain, and the mounds of the ancient city lie at our feet, confused and tumbled, like the waves of a dark sea. How high it is here, how lonely, how silent! Hark that thin plaintive cry, it is the wail of a night-wandering jackal. See how dark it is yonder in the direction of the river. Quick, quick! We have lingered too long, we must be gone at once, for we are already benighted. We ought to have gone down by way of the opposite staircase, which is lined with sculptures of the descending procession, and out through the temple, but there is no time to do anything but scramble down by a breach in the wall, at a point where the mounds yet lie heaped against the south side of the building. And now the dusk steals on so rapidly that before we reach the bottom we can hardly see where to tread. The huge side wall of the portico seems to tower above us to the very heavens. We catch a glimpse of 2 colossal figures, one lion-headed and the other headless, sitting outside with their backs to the temple. Then, making with all speed for the open plain, we clamber over scattered blocks and among shapeless mounds. Presently night overtakes us. The mountains disappear, the temple is blotted out, and we have only the faint starlight to guide us. We stumble on, however, keeping all close together, firing a gun every now and then in the hope of being heard by those in the boats, and as thoroughly and undeniably lost as the babes in the wood. At last, just as some are beginning to knock up and all to despair, Ptolemy fires his last cartridge. An answering shot replies from near by, a wandering light appears in the distance, and presently a whole bevy of dancing lanterns and friendly brown faces comes gleaming out from among a plantation of sugar canes to welcome and guide us home. Dear, sturdy, faithful little Rais Hassan, honest Khalifa, laughing Salome, gentle Mehemet Ali, and Musa, black but comely, they were all there. What a shaking of hands there was, what a gleaming of white teeth, what a shower of mutually unintelligible congratulations. For my own part, I may say with truth that I was never much more rejoiced at a meeting in my life. Chapter 8. Thebes and Karnak, Part 1. Coming on deck the 3rd morning after leaving Dendera, we found the dahabeah decorated with palm branches, our sailors in their holiday turbans, and Rais Hassan en grand tenue, that is to say, in shoes and stockings, which he only wore on very great occasions. Naharak Said, good morning, Luxor, said he, all in one breath. It was a hot, hazy morning, with dim ghosts of mountains glowing through the midst, and a warm wind blowing. We ran to the side, looked out eagerly, but could see nothing. Still the captain smiled and nodded, and the sailors ran hither and thither, sweeping and garnishing, and Agendi, to whom his worst enemy could not have imputed the charge of bashfulness, said, Luxor, Karuf, all right, every time he came near us. We had read and dreamed so much about Thebes, and it had always seemed so far away, that but for this delicate allusion to the promised sheep, we could hardly have believed we were really drawing nigh unto those famous shores. About 10, however, the mist was lifted away like a curtain, and we saw to the left a rich plain studded with palm groves, to the right a broad margin of cultivated lands bounded by a bold range of limestone mountains, and on the farthest horizon another range, all grey and shadowy. Karnak, Gurna, Luxor, says Rais Hassan triumphantly, pointing in every direction at once. Ptolemy tries to show us Medinet Habu and the Memnonium. The painter vows he can see the heads of the sitting colossi and the entrance to the valley of the tombs of the kings. We meanwhile stare bewildered, incredulous, seeing none of these things, finding it difficult, indeed, to believe that any one else sees them. The river widens away before us, the flats are green on either side, the mountains are pierced with terraces of rock-cut tombs, while far away inland, apparently on the verge of the desert, we see here a clump of sycamores, yonder a dark hillock, midway between both a confused heap of something that may either be fallen rock or fallen masonry, but nothing that looks like a temple, nothing to indicate that we are already within recognizable distance of the grandest ruins in the world. Presently, however, as the boat goes on, a massive, windowless structure which looks, heaven preserve us, just like a brand new fort or prison, towers up above the palm groves to the left. This, we are told, is one of the propylons of Karnak, while a few whitewashed huts and a little crowd of masts now coming into sight a mile or two higher up mark the position of Luxor. Then up capers Agendi with his never-failing Luxor, Karuf, all right, to fetch down the tar and darbuka. The captain claps his hands. A circle is formed on the lower deck. The men, all smiles, strike up their liveliest chorus, and so, with barbaric music and well-filled sails, and flags flying, and green boughs waving overhead, we make our triumphal entry into Luxor. The top of another pylon, the slender peak of an obelisk, a colonnade of giant pillars half buried in the soil, the white houses of the English, American, and Prussian consuls, each with its flagstaff and ensign, a steep slope of sandy shore, a background of mud walls and pigeon towers, a foreground of native boats and gaily painted dahabeahs lying at anchor. Such, as we sweep by, is our first panoramic view of this famous village. A group of turbaned officials sitting in the shade of an arched doorway rise and salute us as we pass. The assembled dahabeahs, dozing with folded sails like seabirds asleep, are roused to spasmodic activity. Flags are lowered, guns are fired, all Luxor is startled from its midday siesta. Then, before the smoke has had time to clear off, up comes the Bagstones in gallant form, whereupon the dahabeahs blaze away again as before. And now there is a rush of donkeys and donkey boys, beggars, guides, and antiquity dealers to the shore, the children screaming for baksheesh, the dealers exhibiting strings of imitation scarabs, the donkey boys vociferating the names and praises of their beasts, all alike regarding us as their lawful prey. "Hi, lady! Yankee Doodle donkey! Try Yankee Doodle!" cries one. "Far away Moses!" yells another. "Good donkey! Fast donkey! Best donkey in Luxor!" "This Prince of Wales's donkey!" shouts a third, hauling forward a decrepit little weak-kneed, moth-eaten looking animal, about as good to ride on as a towel horse. "First-rate donkey! Splendid donkey! God save the Queen! Hurrah!" But neither donkeys nor scarabs are of any importance in our eyes just now, compared with the letters we hope to find awaiting us on shore. No sooner, therefore, are the boats made fast than we are all off, some to the British Consulate and some to the Poste Restante, from both of which we return rich and happy. Meanwhile we propose to spend only 24 hours in Luxor. We were to ride round Karnak this first afternoon, to cross to Medinet Habu and the Ramesseum tomorrow morning, and to sail again as soon after midday as possible. We hope thus to get a general idea of the topography of Thebes, and to carry away a superficial impression of the architectural style of the pharaohs. It would be but a glimpse, yet that glimpse was essential, for Thebes represents the great central period of Egyptian art. The earlier styles lead up to that point, the latter depart from it, and neither the earlier nor the later are intelligible without it. At the same time, however, travellers bound for the Second Cataract do well to put off everything like a detailed study of Thebes till the time of coming back. For the present, a rapid survey of the three principal groups of ruins is enough. It supplies the necessary link. It helps one to a right understanding of Edfu, of Philae, of Abu Simbel. In a word, it enables one to put things in their right places, And this, after all, is a mental process which every traveller must perform for himself. Thebes, I need scarcely say, was built like London on both sides of the river. Its original extent must have been very great, but its public buildings, its quays, its thousands of private dwellings are gone and have left few traces. The secular city, which was built of crude brick, is represented by a few insignificant mounds, while of the sacred edifices 5 large groups of limestone ruins, 3 on the western bank and 2 on the eastern, together with the remains of several small temples and a vast multitude of tombs, are all that remain in permanent evidence of its ancient splendor. Luxor is a modern Arab village occupying the site of one of the oldest of these 5 ruins. It stands on the eastern bank, close against the river, about 2 miles south of Karnak and nearly opposite the famous sitting colossi of the western plain. On the opposite bank lie Gurna, the Ramesseum, and Medinet Habu. A glance at the map will do more than pages of explanation to show the relative position of these ruins. The temple of Gurna, it will be seen, is almost vis-à-vis of Karnak. The Ramesseum faces about halfway between Karnak and Luxor. Medinet Habu is placed farther to the south than any building on the eastern side of the river. Behind these 3 western groups, going far and wide along the edge of the Libyan range, lies the great Theban necropolis, while farther back still, in the radiating valleys on the other side of the mountains, are found the tombs of the kings. The distance between Karnak and Luxor is a little less than 2 miles, while from Medinet Habu to the temple of Gurna may be roughly guessed at something under 4. We have here, therefore, some indication of the extent, though not of the limits, of the ancient city. Luxor is a large village inhabited by a mixed population of Copts and Arabs, and doing a smart trade in antiquities. The temple has here formed the nucleus of the village, the older part of which has grown up in and about the ruins. The grand entrance faces north, looking down towards Karnak. The twin towers of the great propylon, dilapidated as they are, stripped of their cornices, encumbered with debris, are magnificent still. In front of them, one on each side of the central gateway, sit 2 helmeted colossi, battered and featureless and buried to the chin, like 2 of the proud in the doleful 5th circle. A few yards in front of these again stands a solitary obelisk, also half buried. The colossi are of black granite, the obelisk is of red, highly polished, and covered on all 4 sides with superb hieroglyphs in 3 vertical columns. These hieroglyphs are engraved with the precision of the finest gem. They are cut to a depth of about 2 inches in the outer columns and 5 inches in the central column of the inscription. The true height of this wonderful monolith is over 70 feet, between 30 and 40 of which are hidden under the accumulated soil of many centuries. Its companion obelisk, already scaling away by imperceptible degrees under the skyey influence of an alien climate, looks down with melancholy indifference upon the petty revolutions and counter-revolutions of the Place de la Concorde. On a line with the 2 black colossi, but some 50 feet or so farther to the west, rises a third and somewhat smaller head of chert or limestone, the fellow to which is doubtless hidden among the huts that encroach halfway across the face of the eastern tower. The whole outer surface of these towers is covered with elaborate sculptures of gods and men, horses and chariots, the pageantry of triumph and the carnage of war. The king in his chariot draws his terrible bow, or slays his enemies on foot, or sits enthroned, receiving the homage of his court. Whole regiments armed with lance and shield march across the scene. The foe flies in disorder. The king, attended by his fan-bearers, returns in state, and the priests burn incense before him. This king is Rameses II, called Sesostris and Ozymandias by ancient writers, and best known to history as Rameses the Great. His actual names and titles, as they stand upon the monuments, are Ra-Yusur Ma Sapt-in Ra, Ramesur Ma Amen, that is to say, Ra, strong in truth, approved of Ra, son of Ra, beloved of Amen. The battle scenes here represented relate to that memorable campaign against the Kheta which forms the subject of the famous Third Sallier Papyrus, and is commemorated upon the walls of almost every temple built by this monarch. Separated from his army and surrounded by the enemy, the king, attended only by his chariot driver, is said to have 6 times charged the foe, to have hewn them down with his sword of might, to have trampled them like straw beneath his horse's feet, to have dispersed them single-handed like a god. 2,500 chariots were there, and he overthrew them, 100,000 warriors, and he scattered them. Those that he slew not with his hand he chased unto the water's edge, causing them to leap to destruction as leaps the crocodile. Such was the immortal feat of Rameses, and such the chronicle written by the royal scribe Pentar. Setting aside the strain of Homeric exaggeration which runs through this narrative, there can be no doubt that it records some brilliant deed of arms actually performed by the king within sight, though not within reach, of his army, and the hieroglyphic text interspersed among these tableaux state that the events depicted took place on the 5th day of the month Epiphi, in the 5th year of his reign. By this we must understand the 5th year of his sole reign, which would be 5 years after the death of his father, Seti I, with whom he had from an early age been associated on the throne. He was a man in the prime of life at the time of this famous engagement, which was fought under the walls of Kadesh on the Orontes, and the bas-relief sculptures show him to have been accompanied by several of his sons, who, though evidently very young, are represented in their war chariots fully armed and taking part in the battle. Chapter 8. Thebes and Karnak, Part 2. The mutilated colossi are portrait statues of the conqueror. The obelisk, in the pompous style of Egyptian dedication, proclaims that the Lord of the world, guardian son of truth, approved of Ra, has built this edifice in honor of his father Amen-Ra, and has erected to him these 2 great obelisks of stone in face of the house of Rameses in the city of Ammon. So stately was the approach made by Rameses the Great to the temple founded about 150 years before his time by Amenhotep III. He also built the courtyard upon which this pylon opened, joining it to the older part of the building in such wise that the original first court became now the second court, while next in order came the portico, the hall of assembly, and the sanctuary. By and by, when the long line of Rameses had passed away, other and later kings put their hands to the work. The names of Shabaka, Sabaco, of Ptolemy Philopator, and of Alexander the Younger appear among the later inscriptions, while those of Amenhotep IV, Kuan-Aten, Horemheb, and Seti, the father of Rameses the Great, are found in the earlier parts of the building. It was in this way that an Egyptian temple grew from age to age, owing a colonnade to this king and a pylon to that, till it came in time to represent the styles of many periods. Hence, too, that frequent irregularity of plan which, unless it could be ascribed to the caprices of successive builders, would form so unaccountable a feature in Egyptian architecture. In the present instance, the pylon and courtyard of Rameses II are set at an angle of 5 degrees to the courtyard and sanctuary of Amenhotep III. This has evidently been done to bring the temple of Luxor into a line with the temple of Karnak, in order that the 2 might be connected by means of that stupendous avenue of sphinxes, the scattered remains of which yet strew the course of the ancient roadway. As I have already said, these half-buried pylons, this solitary obelisk, those giant heads rising in ghastly resurrection before the gates of the temple, were magnificent still. But it was as the magnificence of a splendid prologue to a poem of which only garbled fragments remain. Beyond that entrance lay a smoky, filthy, intricate labyrinth of lanes and passages. Mud hovels, mud pigeon towers, mud yards, and a mud mosque, clustered like wasps' nests in and about the ruins. Architraves sculptured with royal titles supported the roofs of squalid cabins. Stately capitals peeped out from the midst of sheds in which buffaloes, camels, donkeys, dogs, and human beings were seen herding together in an unsavory fellowship. Cocks crew, hens cackled, pigeons cooed, turkeys gobbled, children swarmed, women were baking and gossiping, and all the sordid routine of Arab life was going on, amid winding alleys that masked the colonnades and effaced the inscriptions of the pharaohs. To trace the plan of this part of the building was then impossible. All communication being cut off between the courts and the portico, we had to go round outside and through a door at the farther end of the temple in order to reach the sanctuary and the adjoining chambers. The Arab who kept the key provided an inch or two of candle, for it was very dark in there, the roof being still perfect, with a large, rambling, modern house built on top of it, so that if this part of the temple was ever partially lighted, as at Dendera and elsewhere, by small wedge-like openings in the roof, even those faint gleams were excluded. The sanctuary, which was rebuilt in the reign of Alexander Aegis, some small side chambers, and a large hall, which was perhaps the hall of assembly, were all that remained under cover of the original roofing stones. Some half buried and broken columns on the side next the river showed, however, that this end was formerly surrounded by a colonnade. The sanctuary, an oblong granite chamber with its own separate roof, stands enclosed in a larger hall, like a box within a box, and is covered inside and outside with bas-reliefs. These sculptures, among which I observed a kneeling figure of the king, offering a kneeling image to Amun-Ra, are executed in the mediocre style of the Ptolemies. That is to say, the forms are more natural, but less refined than those of the Pharaonic period. The limbs are fleshy, the joints large, the features insignificant. Of actual portraiture one cannot detect a trace, while every face wears the same objectionable smirk which disfigures the Cleopatra of Dendera. In the large hall, which I have called the Hall of Assembly, one is carried back to the time of the founder. Between Amenhotep III and Alexander Aegis there lies a great gulf of 1200 years, and their styles are as widely separated as their reigns. The merest novice could not possibly mistake the one for the other. Nothing is, of course, more common than to find Egyptian and Greco-Egyptian work side by side in the same temple, but nowhere are the distinctive characteristics of each brought into stronger contrast than in these dark chambers of Luxor. In the sculptures that line the hall of Amenhotep we find the pure lines, the severe and slender forms, the characteristic heads of a period when the art, having as yet neither gained nor lost by foreign influences, was entirely Egyptian. The subjects relate chiefly to the infancy of the king, but it is difficult to see anything properly by the light of a candle tied to the end of a stick, and here, where the bas-relief is so low and the walls are so high, it is almost impossible to distinguish the details of the upper tableau. I could make out, however, that Amun, Mot, and their son Khonsu, the three personages of the Theban triad, are the presiding deities of these scenes, and that they are in some way identified with the fortunes of Thutmose IV, his queen, and their son Amenhotep III. Amenhotep is born, apparently, under the especial protection of Mot, the Divine Mother, brought up with the youthful god Khonsu, and received by Amen as the brother and equal of his own divine son. I think it was in this hall that I observed a singular group representing Amen and Mot in an attitude symbolical, perhaps, of troth-plight or marriage. They sit face to face, the goddess holding in her right hand the left hand of the god, while in her left hand she supports his right elbow. Their thrones, meanwhile, rest on the heads, and their feet are upheld on the hands of two female genii. It is significant that Rameses III and one of the ladies of his so-called harem are depicted in the same attitude in one of the famous domestic subjects sculptured on the upper stories of the pavilion at Medinet Habu. We saw this interesting temple much too cursorily, Yet we gave more time to it than the majority of those who year after year anchor for days together close under its majestic columns. If the whole building could be transported bodily to some point between Memphis and Siout where the river is bare of ruins, it would be enthusiastically visited. Here it is eclipsed by the wonders of Karnak and the western bank, and is undeservedly neglected. Those parts of the original building which yet remain are, indeed, peculiarly precious. For Amenhotep, or Amenoph III, was one of the great builder kings of Egypt, and we have here one of the few extant specimens of his architectural work. The Coptic quarter of Luxor lies north of the great pylon, and partly skirts the river. It is cleaner, wider, more airy than that of the Arabs. The Prussian consul is a Copt, the polite postmaster is a Copt, and in a modest lodging built half beside and half over the Coptic church lives the Coptic bishop. The postmaster, an ungainly youth in a European suit so many sizes too small that his arms and legs appeared to be sprouting out at the ends of his garments, was profuse in his offers of service. He undertook to forward letters to us at Assuan, Khoraso, and Wadi Halfa, where post offices had lately been established. And he kept his promise, I am bound to say, with perfect punctuality, always adding some queer little complimentary message on the outer wrapper, such as, "I hope you well, my compliments," or "wishes you good news, pleasant voyage." As a specimen of his literary style, I copied the following notice, of which it was evident that he was justly proud. Notice: on the commendation, we have ordered the post stations in Lower Egypt from Assuat to Khartoum, belonging to the post Khedive Egyptian in a good order. Now to pay for letters in Lower Egypt is as in Upper Egypt twice. Means that the letters which goes from here far than Assuat must pay for it 2 piastres per 10 grams. Also that which goes far than Khartoum. The letters which goes between Assuat and Khartoum must pay only 1 piastre per 10 grams. This and that is to buy stamps from the post and put it upon the letter. Also, if somebody wishes to send letters insuranced, must 2 piastres more for any letter. There is orderation in the post to receive the letters which goes to Europe, America, and Asia, as England, France, Italy, Germany, Syria, Constantinople, etc. Also to send newspapers, patterns, and other things. Luxor, the 1st January, 1874. L'Espetiore, Monsieur Ada. This young man begged for a little stationery and a penknife at parting. We had, of course, much pleasure in presenting him with such a modest testimonial. We afterwards learned that he levied the same little tribute on every dahabeah that came up the river, so I conclude that he must by this time have quite an interesting collection of small cutlery. From the point where the railroad ends, the Egyptian and Nubian mails are carried by runners stationed at distances of 4 miles all along the route. Each man runs his 4 miles, and at the end thereof finds the next man ready to snatch up his bag and start off at full speed immediately. The next man transfers it in like manner to the next, and so it goes by day and night without a break, till it reaches the first railway station. Each runner is supposed to do his 4 miles in half an hour, and the mail which goes out every morning from Luxor reaches Cairo in 6 days. Considering that Cairo was 450 miles away, that 268 miles of this distance had to be done on foot, and that the trains went only once a day, we thought this a very creditable speed. In the afternoon we took donkeys, and rode out to Karnak. Our way lay through the bazaar, which was the poorest we had yet seen. It consisted of only a few open sheds, in one of which, seated on a mud-built divan, cross-legged and turbanless like a row of tumbler mandarins, we saw 5 of our sailors under the hands of the Luxor barber. He had just lathered all 5 heads, and was complacently surveying the effect of his work, much as an artistic cook might survey a dish of particularly successful meringues à la crème. The meringues looked very sheepish when we laughed and passed by. Next came the straggling suburb where the dancing girls most do congregate. These damsels, in gaudy garments of emerald green, bright rose, and flaming yellow, were squatting outside their cabins or lounging unveiled about the thresholds of 2 or 3 dismal dens of cafes in the market-place. They showed their teeth and laughed familiarly in our faces. Their eyebrows were painted to meet on the bridge of the nose, their eyes were blackened round with kohl, their cheeks were extravagantly rouged, their hair was gummed and greased and festooned upon their foreheads, and plaited all over in innumerable tails. Never before had we seen anything in female form so hideous. One of these houris was black, and she looked quite beautiful in her blackness compared with the painting and plastering of her companions. We now left the village behind, and rode out across a wide plain, barren and hillocky in some parts, overgrown in others with coarse halfa grass, and dotted here and there with clumps of palms. The Nile lay low and out of sight, so that the valley seemed to stretch away uninterruptedly to the mountains on both sides. Now leaving to the left a sheikh's tomb topped by a little cupola and shadowed by a group of tamarisks, now following the bed of a dry watercourse, now skirting shapeless mounds that indicated the site of ruins unexplored, the road, uneven but direct, led straight to Karnak. At every rise in the ground we saw the huge propylons towering higher above the palms. Once, but for only a few moments, there came into sight a confused and widespread mass of ruins, as extensive, apparently, as the ruins of a large town. Then our way dipped into a sandy grove bordered by mud walls and plantations of dwarf palms. All at once this grove widened and became a stately avenue guarded by a double file of shattered sphinxes, and led towards a lofty pylon standing up alone against the sky. Close beside this grand gateway, as if growing there on purpose, rose a thicket of sycamores and palms, while beyond it were seen the twin pylons of a temple. The sphinxes were colossal and measured about 10 feet in length. 1 or 2 were ram-headed. Of the rest, some 40 or 50 in number, all were headless, some split asunder, some overturned, others so mutilated that they looked like torrent-worn boulders. This avenue once reached from Luxor to Karnak. Taking into account the distance, which is just 2 miles from temple to temple, and the short intervals at which the sphinxes are placed, there cannot originally have been fewer than 500 of them. That is to say, 250 on each side of the road. Dismounting for a few minutes, we went into the temple, glanced round the open courtyard with its colonnade of pillars, peeped hurriedly into some ruinous side chambers, and then rode on. Our books told us that we had seen the small temple of Ramesses III. It would have been called large anywhere but at Karnak. Chapter 8. Thebes and Karnak, Part 3. I seem to remember the rest as if it had all happened in a dream. Leaving the small temple, we turned towards the river, skirted the mud walls of the native village, and approached the great temple by way of its main entrance. Here we entered upon what had once been another great avenue of sphinxes, ram-headed, couchant on plinths deep cut with hieroglyphic legends, leading up from some grand landing-place beside the Nile. And now the towers that we had first seen as we sailed by in the morning rose straight before us, magnificent in ruin, glittering to the sun, and relieved in creamy light against the blue depths of sky. One was nearly perfect, the other, shattered as if by the shock of an earthquake, was still so lofty that an Arab clambering from block to block midway of its vast height looked no bigger than a squirrel. On the threshold of this tremendous portal we again dismounted. Shapeless, crude brick mounds, marking the limits of the ancient wall of circuit, reached far away on either side. An immense perspective of pillars and pylons leading up to a very distant obelisk opened out before us. We went in, the great walls towering up like cliffs above our heads, and entered the first court. Here, in the midst of a large quadrangle open to the sky, stands a solitary column, the last of a central avenue of 12, some of which, disjointed by the shock, lie just as they fell, like skeletons of vertebrate monsters left stranded by the flood. Crossing this court in the glowing sunlight, we came to a mighty doorway between two more propylons, the doorway splendid with coloured bas-reliefs, the propylons mere cataracts of fallen blocks piled up to right and left in grand confusion. The cornice of the doorway is gone. Only a jutting fragment of the lintel stone remains. That stone, when perfect, measured 40 feet and 10 inches across. The doorway must have been full 100 feet in height. We went on, leaving to the right a mutilated colossus engraven on arm and breast with the cartouche of Rameses II. We crossed the shade upon the threshold, and passed into the famous hypostyle hall of Seti I. It is a place that has been much written about and often painted, but of which no writing and no art can convey more than a dwarfed and pallid impression. To describe it in the sense of building up a recognizable image by means of words is impossible. The scale is too vast, the effect too tremendous, the sense of one's own dumbness and littleness and incapacity too complete and crushing. It is a place that strikes you into silence, that empties you, as it were, not only of words, but of ideas. Nor is this a first effect only. Later in the year, when we came back down the river and moored close by, and spent long days among the ruins, I found that I never had a word to say in the great hall. Others might measure the girth of those tremendous columns, others might climb hither and thither and find out points of view and test the accuracy of Wilkinson and Mariette, but I could only look and be silent. Yet to look is something, if one can but succeed in remembering, and the great hall of Karnak is photographed in some dark corner of my brain for as long as I have memory. I shut my eyes and see it as if I were there, not all at once as in a picture, but bit by bit, as the eye takes note of large objects and travels over an extended field of vision. I stand once more among those mighty columns, which radiate into avenues from whatever point one takes them. I see them swathed in coiled shadows and broad bands of light. I see them sculptured and painted with shapes of gods and kings, with blazonings of royal names, with sacrificial altars, and forms of sacred beasts, and emblems of wisdom and truth. The shafts of these columns are enormous. I stand at the foot of one, or of what seems to be the foot, for the original pavement lies buried 7 feet below. 6 men standing with extended arms, fingertip to fingertip, could barely span it round. It casts a shadow 12 feet in breadth, such a shadow as might be cast by a tower. The capital that juts out so high above my head looks as if it might have been placed there to support the heavens. It is carved in the semblance of a full-blown lotus, and glows with undying colors, colors that are still fresh, though laid on by hands that have been dust these 3,000 years and more. It would take not 6 men, but a dozen to measure round the curved lip of that stupendous lily. Such are the 12 central columns. The rest, 122 in number, are gigantic too, but smaller. Of the roof they once supported, only the beams remain. Those beams are stones, huge monoliths carved and painted, bridging the space from pillar to pillar, and patterning the trodden soil with bands of shadow. Looking up and down the central avenue, we see at the one end a flame-like obelisk, at the other a solitary palm against a background of glowing mountain. To right, to left, showing transversely through long files of columns, we catch glimpses of colossal bas-reliefs lining the roofless walls in every direction. The king, as usual, figures in every group, and performs the customary acts of worship. The gods receive and approve him. Half in light, half in shadow, these slender, fantastic forms stand out sharp, and clear, and colourless, each figure some 18 or 20 feet in height. They could scarcely have looked more weird when the great roof was in its place and perpetual twilight reigned. But it is difficult to imagine the roof on and the sky shut out. It all looks right as it is, and one feels somehow that such columns should have nothing between them and the infinite blue depths of heaven. The great central avenue was, however, sufficiently lighted by means of a double row of clerestory windows, some of which are yet standing. Certain writers have suggested that they may have been glazed, but this seems improbable for two reasons. Firstly, because one or two of these huge window frames yet contain the solid stone gratings, which in the present instance seem to have done duty for a translucent material, and secondly, because we have no evidence to show that the early Egyptians, though familiar since the days of Cheops with the use of the blowpipe, ever made glass in sheets, or introduced it in this way into their buildings. How often it has been written, and how often must it be repeated, that the great hall at Karnak is the noblest architectural work ever designed and executed by human hands. One writer tells us that it covers 4 times the area occupied by the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Another measures it against St. Peter's. All admit their inability to describe it, yet all attempt the description. To convey a concrete image of the place to one who has not seen it is, however, as I have already said, impossible. If it could be likened to this place or that, the task would not be so difficult, but there is, in truth, no building in the wide world to compare with it. The pyramids are more stupendous. The Colosseum covers more ground. The Parthenon is more beautiful. Yet in nobility of conception, in vastness of detail, in majesty of the highest order, the Hall of Pillars exceeds them every one. This doorway, these columns, are the wonder of the world. How was that lintel stone raised? How were these capitals lifted? Entering among those mighty pillars, says a recent observer, you feel that you have shrunk to the dimensions and feebleness of a fly. But I think you feel more than that. You are stupefied by the thought of the mighty men who made them. You say to yourself, there were indeed giants in those days. It may be that the traveller who finds himself for the first time in the midst of a grove of Wellington gigantea feels something of the same overwhelming sense of awe and wonder. But the great trees, though they have taken 3,000 years to grow, lack the pathos and the mystery that comes of human labor. They do not strike their roots through 6,000 years of history. They have not been watered with the blood and tears of millions. Their leaves know no sounds less musical than the singing of birds, or the moaning of the night wind as it sweeps over the highlands of Calaveros. But every breath that wanders down the painted aisles of Karnak seems to echo back the sighs of those who perished in the quarry, at the oar, and under the chariot wheels of the conqueror. The Hypostyle Hall, though built by Seti, the father of Ramesses II, is supposed by some Egyptologists to have been planned, if not begun, by that same Amenhotep III who founded the temple of Luxor, and set up the famous Colossi of the Plain. However this may be, the cartouches so lavishly sculptured on pillar and architrave contain no names but those of Seti, who undoubtedly executed the work en bloc, and of Ramesses, who completed it. And now, would it not be strange if we knew the name and history of the architect who superintended the building of this wondrous hall, and planned the huge doorway by which it was entered, and the mighty pylons which lie shattered on either side? Would it not be interesting to look upon his portrait, and see what manner of man he was? Well, the Egyptian room in the Glyptotek Museum at Munich contains a statue found some 70 years ago at Thebes, which almost certainly represents that man, and is inscribed with his history. His name was Bak en Khonsu, servant of Khonsu. He sits upon the ground, bearded and robed, in an attitude of meditation. That he was a man of unusual ability is shown by the inscriptions engraved upon the back of the statue. These inscriptions record his promotion step by step to the highest grade of the hierarchy. Having attained the dignity of high priest and first prophet of Amen during the reign of Seti I, He became the chief architect of the Thebaid under Ramesses II, and received a royal commission to superintend the embellishment of the temples. When Ramesses II erected a monument to his divine father Amen-Ra, the building thereof was executed under the direction of Bak-en-Khonsu. Here the inscription, as translated by M. de Vera, goes on to say that he made the sacred edifice in the upper gate of the abode of Amen. He erected obelisks of granite. He made golden flagstaffs. He added very, very great colonnades. M. de Vera suggests that the temple of Gurna may here be indicated, but to this it might be objected that Gurna is situated in the lower and not the upper part of Thebes, that at Gurna there are no great colonnades and no obelisks, and that, moreover, for some reason at present unknown to us, the erection of obelisks seems to have been almost wholly confined to the eastern bank of the Nile. It is, however, possible that the works here enumerated may not all have been executed for one and the same temple. The sacred edifice in the upper gate of the abode of Amen might be the temple of Luxor, which Ramesses did in fact adorn with the only obelisks we know to be his in Thebes. The monument erected by him to his divine father Amen, evidently a new structure, would scarcely be any other than the Ramesseum, while the very, very great colonnades, which are expressly specified as additions, would seem as if they could only belong to the hypostyle hall of Karnak. The question is at all events interesting, and it is pleasant to believe that in the Munich statue we have not only a portrait of one who, at Karnak, played the part of Michelangelo to some foregone and forgotten Bramante, but who was also the Ictinus of the Ramesseum. For the Ramesseum is the Parthenon of Thebes. The sun was sinking and the shadows were lengthening when, having made the round of the principal ruins, we at length mounted our donkeys and turned toward Luxor. To describe all that we saw after leaving the great hall would fill a chapter. Huge obelisks of shining granite, some yet erect, some shattered and prostrate, vast lengths of sculptured walls covered with wondrous battle subjects, sacerdotal processions, and elaborate chronicles of the deeds of kings, ruined courtyards surrounded by files of headless statues, a sanctuary built all of polished granite and engraven like a gem, a second hall of pillars dating back to the early days of Thutmose III, labyrinths of roofless chambers, mutilated colossi, shattered pylons, fallen columns, unintelligible foundations, and hieroglyphic inscriptions without end, were glanced at, passed by, and succeeded by fresh wonders. I dare not say how many small outlying temples we saw in the course of that rapid survey. In one place we came upon an undulating tract of coarse halfa grass, in the midst of which, battered, defaced, forlorn, sat a weird company of green granite sphinxes and lioness-headed basts. In another we saw a magnificent colossal hawk upright on his pedestal in the midst of a bergfall of ruins. More avenues of sphinxes, more pylons, more colossi were passed before the road we took in returning brought us round to that by which we had come. By the time we reached the Sheikh's tomb it was nearly dusk. We rode back across the plain, silent and bewildered. Have I not said that it was like a dream?